part 2 of our Topics Tuesday that we've just launched on the DPRK, on Korea. And our first Topics Tuesday series we did was on Russia and Ukraine. That is available up in a playlist on YouTube if you want to check that out. But we are just getting started on this one on Korea. Last time what we did is go over this article by Mark J. Sher about U.S. policy in Korea from 1945 to 1948, the implementation of the neo-colonial model. Today we will still be talking about this era. And I just want to let everybody know that I'm also currently doing podcast episodes about this in more deep dive format, and those are available on YouTube. The parts of that have come out already as well, which are a little bit different than this content and have different sources and different references. So you can listen to both supplementarily and you'll understand what's going on, but it won't necessarily be exactly the same. So you'll get a more comprehensive understanding. And there's also a link here to the video interview with No Dol. So if you have friends and family who might watch a long video interview with Korean activists, you can link them to that as well. That's included here. 40-part podcast, go! Exactly. So let's get into today's starting out topic, which is going to be reading through this article from Hampton Think. So Hampton Think is the think tank, right, of Fred Hampton's memory honor. So Hampton Think is a great think tank that's a good reference point for you to go to for left-wing political positions. And this article came out on January 8th, 2020, and it is about this era in Korea as well. Now, this is the interwar period. This is the end of World War II has already occurred, but the Korean War has not yet started. And this is a period of time, for reference for anybody who missed last week, where the Korean people at first think they are going to be liberated and they are not going to be under imperial Japanese control, only to find that the United States has decided to divide their country in half, take the South for itself that has more access to natural resources and strategic location, and enact a brutal military dictatorship there in the South. And meanwhile, in the North, they're kind of left to do whatever they want because the North doesn't have a lot of access to natural resources. Everybody's trying to make sure they don't go into World War III. Technically, the USSR is a protectorate of the North, but by all accounts, they don't really have to do much because the North is very communist and is being now led by a war hero, Kim Il-sung, who had helped fight against Japan. So he's very, very popular, not just in the North, but with everybody in the South. Now, what's worth noting is that the people in the South were not happy to be colonized. They fought back against this. They wanted to reunify their country. The people in the North also wanted to reunify their country. So that's a good perspective. So getting into this article, a lot of these will cover the same information. It's just reinforcing the information. So this might be some stuff you heard last week as well. So this is written by Riley Bove. The history behind the division of Korea into the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, or North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, ROK, or South Korea, is a complicated matter that crosses many spheres. Also, this is going to be an easier read than last week. Last week's was more of an academic article. This is more popular speak. The history between the U.S. and Korea dates back to the Joseon Dynasty, when American missionaries introduced Christianity to the peninsula through mission trips and the building of orphanages. When the Japanese colonized the Korean peninsula at the turn of the 20th century, it led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, the enslavement of Korean people, as well as the violent suppression of culture, language, and national sovereignty. After World War II and the defeat of Japanese colonialism and the liberation of Korea, the U.S. enacted both military and governmental control on the southern half of the peninsula. The Korean War was one of many conflicts during which U.S. imperialism acted through proxies to contest the global struggle for socialism and national liberation through the U.S.'s containment policy. The point of this article is to explore the ways in which the U.S. has enacted imperialism and neocolonialism on the Korean Peninsula since its division in the post-World War II era and into the present day. While much attention is paid to the devastation the U.S. caused and continues to cause in the DPRK, the article focuses more on the divisive and exploitative role it's played in the ROK. And this is something, too, that people don't think about a lot. We think about the DPRK and how obvious the propaganda is against them, how violent the blockade is against them, how we increasingly use more and more aggressive military-based rhetoric against them. But what many people do not understand is the South is actively under a military occupation by the USA. So this is going to talk a little bit more about that. The history of the exploitation of the Korean Peninsula dates back to the colonization of Korea by Japan in 1910. By the 20th century, the Korean Peninsula had already come under the Japanese sphere of influence and under the militarized gaze of the Meiji government. By 1910, Korea was fully under Japanese colonial rule. And if you listen to my podcast episodes about this, you'll remember the people of Korea responded by fighting back very, very valiantly and very, very hard. And when they felt that they could no longer fight, they started committing mass suicide in protest. So, something about like how Orientalism manifests, right, in the West, I feel, is that we infantilize Asian people. I think there's this idea that the people in the North are all victims, helpless victims who don't know how to do anything, and they're just stuck under this repressive thing. And the people of the South are, just kind of backwards, and they need our guidance because they're too weak to do anything for themselves. This is not the reality of any people, I don't think. It's a very weird way to code any group of people. But in particular, we have a lot of evidence showing that the people of Korea are in fact, if we were to make any generalizations, we would want to generalize the opposite. These are people who do not take kindly to oppression. They do not want to be colonized. They do not want to be controlled. They're willing to put their lives on the line for it. So if you've ever watched Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang, there's a part where one of the men being interviewed is like, if we didn't like our government, we would just overthrow it. What kind of a question is that, right? Like, what? And that's so real to them because this is the history of what it means to be Korean. What it means to be Korean is to fight, right? To fight back, to stand up for yourself, to defend yourself, right? And it's very the opposite of how the West paints Korea today. And what it tells you is it takes the full force, 62 military bases, or 64, over 60 military bases in South Korea to keep our imperial control over these people. And so this is, I think, very, very important to the story, is the fight back. So American missionaries had already been in contact with the Korean Peninsula starting in the 1880s, spreading the evangelical faith throughout and beginning the connection between Korea and the West. Japan had set its imperialist sights on conquering the rest of the Pacific by 1940. From 1910 to 1945, Korea was subjected to a brutal 35-year-long colonization by the Japanese. For example, Korean women experienced sexual subjugation under Japanese rule. In her essay, The Korean Comfort Women Movement for Redress, Sarah So Chung-hee states, Japan began drafting Korean women in full force from around 1937 when its army invaded China and when soldiers raped and murdered tens of thousands of Chinese women in Nanjing. While occupying Korea, Japan forced women into sexual slavery, and men, women, and children were murdered by the Japanese as they moved to fight the indigenous resistance movements that emerged. So when they talk about the indigenous resistance movements that emerged, these were major and significant. By the end of World War II, the liberation of Korea was underway as revolutionaries swept the Japanese imperialists from the peninsula. Both the Soviet Union and the U.S. consolidated to rebuild the peninsula after the liberation movement. The Soviets helped the North establish a workers-led state and reclaim the land previously owned by the landlords. There were preparations to have a People's Republic in Korea that was of, by, and for Koreans. So you guys probably remember from last week when they were talking about the People's Committees that emerged. The USSR, again, remember, even if you know people who aren't communists, who aren't socialists, whatever, logically, just rationally, the USSR did not have to do much because the resistance movement that had emerged in Korea against Japan had been largely rooted in Marxism and socialism. They were a peninsula of a lot of communists. So when the Soviets showed up, they were beleaguered. They'd been battered down by World War II. They won. They were victorious, but they sacrificed a lot to be able to win that war. Millions of people lost their lives, right? They had to rebuild their country's multinational federation. They had to rebuild the USSR. So they didn't have to do much in the North. And they were very, very happy to see that the people of Korea had their own models of government set up. They were like, okay, hands off. Now, the United States was one of the only major players in World War II that was not destroyed by World War II. So the United States had more money, more energy, more resources, and were more interested in having an active role. So again, you don't have to be a communist to understand why the USSR was not super active in North Korea. They didn't need to be. And they didn't particularly want to deal with that right now. They had other things going on. So just in case you're ever talking to somebody who's not a socialist and they're like, yeah, right, like the USSR didn't do anything. It's like, dude, they were just devastated by war. They didn't have the resources to do anything there. Even if they wanted to, they would not have had the resources available for that. They had to rebuild their land. I know, the term comfort women is a horrible euphemism for forced sexual slavery. Yeah. So back where we left off, Anna Louise Strong, in her report for the CIA, writes that when the Americans landed in Korea, the Koreans already had a de facto government. A People's Republic had been declared a day earlier by a Congress of Koreans themselves. General John R. Hodge, commander of the U.S. Armed Forces, dissolved this People's Republic and drove most of its members underground. Strong details how, between the liberation of Korea and the creation of the state of South Korea, a people's democracy was already established in the South. However, the American forces overthrew the de facto government and established a U.S.-backed puppet military dictatorship. The North established their own government without any assistance from foreign powers, while in the South, the Americans maintained their iron grip, which has continued to the present day. So really think about this. The Korean people are liberated from Japan, yay. And they're like, cool, we have our own government set up, we're running, we're cooking, we've got everything handled, we're jumping to it, we've made these people's committees, they're all working with each other, we're getting things done. And then the United States is like, haha, actually, your country, not one country anymore, two countries, boop, arbitrary line at the 38th parallel. And then so the USSR shows up in the North and was like, oh, cool, we like what you've done with the place. Let us know if you need any help. The Americans show up in the South and they're like, this is a fucking nightmare. This is our worst case scenario. These are a bunch of socialists who set up their own government here. We need to crush it. We need to destroy it. And that is what the United States has to do. So the United States starts overthrowing the Korean people now. The Korean people have won their liberation from Japan. The United States has essentially overthrown Japan from Korea, even though they didn't act like it. They were actually very, very buddy-buddy in the handover stage. When the Americans arrived in Korea and the Japanese forces had not yet left, they actually had parties together. And hung out and were like, you lost, but haha, good game. And discussed together how to make sure the Korean people did not have agency over the peninsula. They strategized together because both Japan and the United States, even though they'd been enemies just a few days before in World War II, thought that the idea of all of Korea going communist was a much greater threat to them. So that's really important to understand in this as well. And so the United States shows up and is like, we got to shut this down. After the American intervention and the toppling of the de facto People's Republic of Korea government, the American imperialists implanted a pro-U.S. ally, Syngman Rhee, in order to govern the southern half of the peninsula. Rhee was a Western-educated Korean who had anti-Japanese credentials, but was fully in the pocket of Washington and Wall Street. So when they talk about this, it's something you need to know is that Rhee was born in Korea, but he was like 70 years old when this started. He had spent most of his life in the United States. So he had an Ivy League education. His wife was Austrian. He was already doing work with the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA in the United States. He had a lot of friends in powerful places, especially in the Republican Party. So when they say that they implanted Rhee, they literally flew Rhee from the United States to Korea and were like, look, your hero returned. And the Korean people were like, who the fuck is this guy? And they're like, you love him. He's your hero. You love him. And they were like, we don't know who this guy fucking is. So this was a very tense moment as well. So to the Korean people, he was basically American, right? Even though he did spend decades of his life in Korea, like 40 years of his life he had spent in the United States. He was gone for all of a lot of the Japanese occupation. Once Syngman Rhee was in power, he imposed a suppressive crackdown on all dissidents. In their essay, Organizing Dissent Against Authoritarianism, Park Mee states that even a moderate dissident became equated as a pro-communist, pro-North Korean activist that was deemed to be prosecuted under the National Security Law. The National Security Act, NSA, became the justification for repressive actions of the Rhee regime, including massacres that totaled in the hundreds of thousands. So when we say the Korean people fought back, they fought back, and it ended with hundreds of thousands of them being slaughtered. Park also details that military confrontation with North Korea was used as an excuse to justify violations of human rights and the suppression of political dissidents. The geopolitical landscape of divided Korea was used by the South Korean U.S. government as a justification for the suppression of the people's right to self-determination. At the same time in the United States during the 1950s, McCarthyism reigned over the political landscape of post-war America. McCarthyism was defined as a second Red Scare, a time of anti-communist sentiment and political repression in which the entire organized left was almost incapacitated, with its leaders jailed or driven underground, and anyone who had any pro-communist or even pro-peace sentiments blacklisted. In the ROK, the Rhee regime enacted its own McCarthyism era under the NSA in order to snuff out and execute thousands of suspected communists. And I think this is a really interesting parallel. Rhee, at one point, when a number of Republicans, kind of McCarthy-ish Republicans, had won positions of power in Congress, flew back to the United States and went above General Hodge's head to be like, we actually need to be more fucked up to communists in Korea. Can I get your help? Because he was close with these Republicans in U.S. Congress. So Rhee even went kind of rogue from General Hodge and his occupation for a point in time because he thought that they could be more aggressive with their anti-communist rhetoric. After the Rhee administration was overthrown in the 1961 coup, Park Chung-hee rose to power and declared martial law under the Yushin Constitution, which allowed Park to openly violate civil liberties and assume total control of the government. Under his regime, worker unions and other types of mass organizing were suppressed, and thousands of union members and organizers were brutally murdered. They faced sexual assault and rape, as well as other forms of police violence. Student organizers, as well as organizations deemed to be Marxist-oriented, were brutally suppressed under the Park regime. Park was assassinated in 1979, and another pro-U.S. dictator, Chun Doo-hwan, took power. Political and civil tension culminated in the Gwangju Massacre in 1980, in which 2,000 people, including student-led activist groups and anti-government demonstrators, were murdered by the military and governmental forces. Chun remained in power until 1988. Leading up to the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul, the Chun government attempted to make the city more presentable. Park Mi writes that the Chun government introduced a beautification of the environment bill, which was designed to eliminate slums and unregistered street vendors. The Chun government had attempted to gentrify the city, leaving the poor and working class citizens in poverty and forced many into homelessness. All while this was happening, the U.S. government, from Harry Truman to Ronald Reagan, actively supported and endorsed the brutal regimes. In the 1980s, the U.S. sent a massive influx of capital to South Korea. It was only during this time that the GDP of the South overtook that of the North. So really think about what this means. We know that the North would end up getting devastated in the Korean War. Even so, the communists were able to rebuild and have a more thriving economy than the South, the capitalists in the South. This was actually a source of humiliation for the United States. So the United States started sending a lot of money to South Korea to bolster them so that we could make them look more profitable and successful than the North. At the end of World War II, the country had been transformed into one of the poorest countries in the world. The Korean War, which spanned from 1950 to 1953, economically devastated the entirety of the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. military and other allied forces firebombed and destroyed 22 out of the 24 cities in the northern half. Thousands of people died in the war, and hundreds of thousands of children became orphaned and displaced during and after the war. If you talk to Korean adoptees, we basically did the racist human trafficking adoption thing with a lot of these Korean orphans. So there's also this whole thing about importing generational trauma through our U.S. adoption system, which is basically a glorified opportunity to buy and sell children of color. And this is what we did with these Korean orphans, a lot of them. While the U.S. fought under the flag of the UN, this was nothing more than a fig leaf for U.S. imperialism. And one of the most infamous massacres to happen during the Korean War, a U.S. cavalry regiment had opened fire on a crowd of South Korean refugees, murdering between 150 to 300 of them. It would be known as the No-Gun-Ri Massacre. Many years after, the U.S. military attempted to whitewash the massacre, and it still has not been held accountable. In her book, From Orphan to Adoptee, Soo Jin-pat critically analyzes the role of militarized humanitarianism in the birth of transnational adoptions of Korean children after the Korean War. Pat writes that, however, its location, its close proximity to the Soviet Union, made Korea extremely important to the United States. Pate describes that even though the mountainous landscape of the Korean Peninsula did not offer any crucial resources to the United States that they couldn't get elsewhere, the proximity to the Soviet Union made the Korean Peninsula an important geopolitical area. Also China, I want to point out. This is true, but it is also important to acknowledge that Korea was and is targeted because the DPRK social and economic system remains antithetical to capitalism and imperialism. And this is really true. The United States was aware of this. They knew that Korea was full of communists. Japan told them. Japan was like, hey, just so you know, the war is coming to an end. World War II is coming to an end. We know we're going to lose control of Korea. You should know, USA, this place is full of communists, and we have spent years trying to slaughter them all, and it has not been successful. So that's why we should work together to make sure that the communists don't take over. And this was really the negotiating between Japan and the United States at the end of World War II. Pate also writes about the conditions of post-war South Korea for orphans. In addition, 100,000 children were left without homes and separated from their families, so that by the end of the war, over 40,000 orphans resided in orphanages. The devastation of the Korean War left children without parents, and the orphanages that already existed were overfilled. Missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, along with American NGOs, built more orphanages and provided materials for food and other necessities. If you don't know, NGO, non-governmental organization, here in the United States, that's kind of a quasi-designation. These are quasi-governmental organizations much of the time. So the National Endowment for Democracy, for example, that's an NGO technically. It's a non-governmental organization. It's funded 100% by Congress and usually staffed with people from the CIA or from the American government intelligence community. So a lot of these NGOs might actually literally be just the United States government operating in a non-governmental capacity to get away with more. Under the backdrop of the U.S. Military occupation in the Korean War, this type of humanitarianism became militarized. Pate also echoes this sentiment. Militarism and humanitarianism became conflated through programs such as Armed Forces Assistance to Korea and Korean Civil Assistance Command, which produced what I call militarized humanitarianism. Also under this backdrop of militarized humanitarianism, NGOs such as Holt International became frontrunners in the transnational adoptions of Korean orphans. With this, American families flocked to adopt children under the guise of saving. This type of savior complex often drove the NGOs like Holt International to be one of the most profitable companies in adoption of children. By contrast, orphans in the DPRK remained in the country, and the government provided them with excellent shelter, education, healthcare, and other resources. In the DPRK, war orphans were something like national heroes. Images of cold, hungry, and threadbare children filling their stomachs with food donated by American and other Western countries inflated the image of the U.S. military and others as saviors to these war-torn children. A lot of these Korean orphans were exploited by public relations and the military in order to further conflate this trope. Images of children smiling, interacting with American servicemen became the poster for militarized humanitarianism. American media campaigns started to funnel money in editorials describing the orphans as victims of communism, right? With this mass campaign, American NGOs and other organizations donated immense resources. The influx of media attention and campaigns became the driving force of Korean adoptions. Pate describes the conditions of adoption as follows. The geopolitics of the Cold War and the discourse of Cold War Orientalism created a particular set of conditions that made the bodies of Korean children highly desirable. She also writes that these children were highly desirable because they were perceived as exotic and cute, and because they were perhaps the least threatening group of Asians that the United States had ever encountered. Because of the anti-communist sentiment that plagued American society in Cold War politics, this made Korean children highly sought after for international adoption. Korean children were seen as non-threatening because many of them were extremely young, infants or toddlers, so assimilation into American society would be easier than with older children. Orientalism also played a part of the tropes of Korean children being more submissive towards assimilation tactics and being perceived as non-enemies. And again, this is not even accurate. It's not like anything historically would support Americans being able to draw this conclusion. I mean, again, Korean people were literally like, I will kill myself before I let you take over me. Like, there were mass waves of protest fighting back against this. So this is, again, just goes into the creepy white person way of viewing Asian people. The fetishization of Korean girls had to do with similar Orientalist tropes of East Asian women as docile and hyper-feminized. Pate describes the phenomenon this way. The Oriental doll connotes femininity, exoticness, delicateness, silence, and docility. These very descriptions became assigned to the Korean female orphan. The commodification of Korean women, in other words, relied on racist, misogynistic, imperialist views of Korean women as doll-like. And I also want to talk about this today. I made a TikTok about this, but it didn't get any views. But the obsession with K-beauty, if you guys have seen like the Korean beauty obsession, it's kind of playing out in this along these same lines. I've seen a lot of people on TikTok Shop, in particular white women, will be selling Korean beauty products on TikTok Shop, and they use the same kind of language and like Western standard viewpoint of Korean women. They're like, a Korean woman told me this is why her skin always looks like this and her boyfriend doesn't leave her, or things like this. Just very fucking weird. Like, it still happens to this day. Yeah, K-beauty obsession is very, very weird. As Pate writes, the interaction of Korean women with U.S. military servicemen was used as a bargaining chip and to help maintain friendly relations between the U.S. and South Korea. Korean women and young female orphans were often forcibly recruited into sex work for the U.S. military. These type of camp towns became a hotbed of sexual assault and rape. This form of exploitation towards Korean women echoes the brutal sexual violence that was forced upon Korean women by Japanese imperialists during the colonization of Korea in World War II. Sujin Pate wrote that the United States adopted a boys will be boys policy towards camp town prostitution in South Korea. They were able to justify the policy by linking military prostitution to issues of national security. Citing a 1965 study on troop-community relations conducted by the 8th U.S. Army, the U.S. military, as Pate argues, adopted a more turning a blind eye policy towards camp town and military prostitution, sexual exploitation as U.S. imperialism had evolved into the misogynistic sex industry. Also worth noting here, this is not, like when we talk about sex worker comrades today, right, a lot of the development that's been made in sex work has allowed women to be free of like a pimp relationship of exploitation for sex work practices, which is something that the internet has actually helped advance for a number of people, the potential for that. However, in these situations, very often in roundabout ways, the U.S. government would be acting as a pimp to these women, or the military system would be acting as a pimp to these women. There would be people who had been given privileged positions under imperialism and colonization from Japan, and then later the United States, who are acting as madams, right, in these scenarios. So there's a lot that goes into this. These women were forced into this by a foreign power, often by the United States, and the United States was basically acting as their pimp. So just in terms of labor exploitation. Park Chung-hee had encouraged this sort of sexual exploitation as it fueled the South Korean economy. Pimp state, exactly. The Cold War era had turned South Korea into a neoliberal and capitalist hotspot. It's kind of the same thing that happened in Cuba as well. When we say that women were forced into sexual slavery or forced to do survival sex work in Cuba, a lot of that was for the benefit of multinational or straight up American corporations, right? So American businessmen were profiting from that. And if not directly, in roundabout ways, but they still served empire. Even after the partial revitalization of the South Korean economy in the 1960s, political and inequitable economic woes dominated the geopolitical landscape of South Korea for decades. With the birth of neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s, South Korea's economy was boosted by technological companies, such as Samsung and Hyundai, primarily trading with its neo-colonial ally, the United States. Social issues such as high rates of suicide have been a consequence of the overbearing demands for production, with little to no compensation for the workers themselves. As Jay Sewell wrote in an article for antiimperialism.org, I cannot state all the suicide cases here, but note well that the suicide rate in South Korea is the top among OECD nations. Toward the beginning of the 2000s, anti-American sentiment began in full swing in South Korea as two events, the 2002 Yangju Highway incident, where two Korean schoolgirls were fatally killed by a U.S. military vehicle, and the murder of Young Jam-ee in 1992, where a bartender was murdered by a U.S. military private. These two events brought up the question of USFK's United States Forces Korea continued presence in Korea. These are just some of the ways that the U.S. imperialism and neocolonialism manifest on the Korean Peninsula, and why the U.S.'s presence in South Korea is detrimental and has only led to the division and exploitation of the ROK. However, the puppet regimes also had committed violence and murder with the full support of its neocolonial ally. The U.S. military occupation of South Korea remains the primary obstacle to peace and reunification of our homeland. The United States needs to end its military occupation of South Korea and dismantle all of its military bases and facilities, paying reparation to all of the peoples of Korea. And we have a Fanon quote at the end that says, "For a colonized people, the most essential value because the most concrete is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity." So the author of this, Riley Bove, Seung-Yoon Park, is a student at the time this was written from Indiana University, Purdue, and an organizer with the Answer Coalition. So some of you may have done protest work with the Answer Coalition. This is an Answer Coalition piece. Okay. All right. So moving on, I'm going to do your hydrates now, and then we're going to get into the next piece today. And again, if you have any questions from that, it'll probably be covered in the next two pieces we read. All of these are supposed to work together to kind of give you a comprehensive understanding of the United States kind of taking over in Korea. Okay. I love Topics Tuesdays. These are the best days to me. You know what? I like Theory Thursday too. I like them both. I just feel like in a world of short form content, so many people think they can watch a 3-minute video or read a headline and understand a situation. And it's like, well, no. You have to do so much work. Like, this is an entry level reading list, right? There are books on I haven't even put on here, I think, that I've read if I look around my house. We will never run out of topics. The world continues to move. Okay. So, Haikubashi. Yeah, explain in 140 characters why communism isn't evil right now. Right, exactly. So, this next piece we're going to do is a little bit more academic again, bouncing back between writing styles. This is Early History of U.S. Imperialism in Korea by R. Krishnan. This one, if I'm remembering correctly, might be, too long for us to read all of, so we might have to do a jump around, but we'll see. I'm trying to remember the page count on this one. Hold on. Pulling it up. It's 16 pages. I think we can do it. We'll get through it. Yes. And then we get to, after this, go to Larry for Juche Day continued. All right. Early History of U.S. Imperialism in Korea. In May of 1982, amidst much fanfare and publicity, the United States and South Korea celebrated the centennial of the Treaty of Peace, Amity, Commerce, and Navigation between the Kingdom of Chosun, Korea, and the USA. The treaty, among other things, provided for the opening of diplomatic relations and the establishment of permanent missions in the capitals of two countries. During the centennial celebration, Ronald Reagan and Chon Do-hwan spoke glowingly of the first century of U.S.-Korean official relations and hoped that the second century would witness even more glorious relations. In a proclamation of the occasion, Reagan said, This treaty marked a new chapter in the history of Northeast Asia and was the auspicious beginning of an enduring partnership between the United States and Korea. Americans are proud of the role they have played in Korean history, especially during these last 100 years. I just want you to picture Ronald Reagan saying this after everything you've just heard about what the United States' role had been in Korea, literally forcing people into sexual slavery, exploiting them, and massacring them. In 1945, he says, American soldiers were crucial to the restoration of this ancient land's independence. They were not independent. They were under U.S. military occupation. Reagan was indulging in something more than rhetoric. He was distorting the history of U.S.-Korean relations and the American role in Korean history. The nature of the distortion and its implications are discussed in his essay. To be sure, U.S.-Korean relations did not begin with the Treaty of 1882. It would also be wrong to characterize the treaty as marking a new chapter in the history of Northeast Asia. 1982. I think I've told you guys this before, but I feel like in the scanning process where a lot of these old papers are ending up online, they're using like visual recognition of things and it's getting mistranslated. So sometimes when you read old papers, especially on Marxist.org, this happens as well, you'll see things that look like typos, and I think it's literally just the process of digitizing old paperwork is leading to this. All right, so... Oh, no, this is the centennial. Never mind. This is fine. 1882 is when the thing was saying. Sorry, I just messed that up. 1982 is the centennial. Yeah. It would also be wrong to characterize the treaty as marking a new chapter in the history of Northeast Asia in any positive sense. The treaty was preceded by more than a decade and a half of stormy relations marked by the efforts of the Koreans to resist the intimidatory and aggressive activities of the U.S. armed vessels and naval expeditionary forces to force open the Hermit Kingdom. The treaty should be seen more as a product of the gunboat diplomacy that the U.S. employed, just like any other imperialist power of the 19th century. Indeed, as an author so aptly observed, Commodore R.W. Shufeldt's act of opening Korea in 1882 was, quote, one of the most vivid examples of episodes in a well-defined pattern of global gunboat diplomacy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, literally when the West, and any capacity Europe or the United States, wanted to force a country to do trade with it, they would literally show up with boats parked along the perimeter with guns pointed at them, and then a guy would get off a boat and be like, hey, we're here to do trade, so you can trade with me, or you can deal with them. And so it really like forced people. The United States actually did this with Japan as well, pretty famously. And when this happened to Japan, Japan was like, we do not like being bullied by Europe. We are instead going to try to become like Germany and study Germany's ways. And that's how we ended up with fascist Japan. Very interesting. Yeah, literally gunboat diplomacy. Kobashi, this is from our North Korea research documents. This is the R.R. Krishnan piece, the third piece down. The USA had broken the seclusion policy of Japan through the black ships of the Commodore Perry in 1853 and imposed crushing trade agreements upon China, and was now forcing Korea open to gain access to its rich natural resources like gold, to extract monopoly rights in respect of electricity, the railways, the waterways, the streetcars, and to obtain trade concessions. Its plan was to use Korea as a strategic springboard for more effective armed intervention in the Far East and for facilitation of the spread of Christian missionary activity. So also worth remembering here, because we live in the government of merchants, and that's really the best way to think about capitalism in my opinion. We live in a government created by merchants to be their ideal government. All of this comes down to, of course, trade. And it seems so silly. We did all this for trade deals. We took over countries for trade deals. Yes, of course, because we live in the government of merchants. This is the dream government concocted by merchants, right? By salespeople, by retailers. The treaty marked the concluding phase of the circuit of unequal treaties through which the USA opened the countries of East Asia to the West. Commodore Shufeldt boastfully claimed that by concluding the treaty, he had accomplished, quote, the feat of bringing the last of the exclusive countries within the pale of Western civilization. Just as his senior, Commodore Perry, had accomplished a similar feat vis-a-vis Japan in 1853. By 1882, the USA concluded a treaty with Korea on the lines of the Treaty of Kangwa, which Japan had imposed on Korea in 1876, and the treaties that the USA itself had concluded with China. The weak, faction-ridden royal court of Korea was just not capable of resisting the USA any longer. Besides, China, to which Korea historically tended to look for protection and support, prevailed upon the Korean court to yield to the U.S. pressure to open Korea, in the vain hope that the U.S. influence on Korea would act as a deterrent on an expansionist Japan. In light of this historical background, Reagan's argument that the treaty marked a new chapter in the history of Northeast Asia seems to conceal the imperialist advance of the USA in East Asia and the disastrous consequences it had for Korea. Reagan also claimed the treaty marked the auspicious beginning of an enduring partnership, and that the Americans were proud of the role they had played in the past 100 years of Korean history, from 1882 to 1982. It is fallacious and motivated to argue that U.S.-Korean official relations have had an uninterrupted or continuous history, or a history characterized by enduring partnership. Such an argument conveniently overlooks the blank periods in the relations between Korea and the USA as two sovereign, independent entities. It also overlooks the period when the USA formally imposed its military government in Korea, the U.S. Army Military Government in Korea, USA MGIK, between September 1945 and August 1948. It implies that the Republic of Korea, a progeny of U.S. military government in Korea that came into being on August 15, 1948, and to which the USA was the first to give de jure recognition in January 1, 1949, is the only historically and politically legitimate successor to the Kingdom of Chosun, with which the USA had concluded the Treaty of 1882. In other words, the implication of the argument are that 1. The Republic of Korea's ante-state history goes back to the last dynasty of the Kingdom of Chosun, and that 2. The political entity called the Republic of Korea, which was created by the U.S. military government, and Korea as a geographical, ethnic, cultural, historical, and national entity are identical. How continuous was the history of the so-called U.S.-Korean official relations? How enduring was the partnership? And how edifying was the U.S. role in Korean history? Let us look at the facts. There was a complete blank and a total and formal break in official relations between Korea and USA as sovereign independent entities from 1905 to 1945, i.e. for a period of 40 years. The USA closed its diplomatic mission in Seoul in November 1905 and withdrew its recognition of Korea as a sovereign independent state. It was the very state which the USA had so desperately wanted to recognize as an independent entity just 23 years before. And also worth noting, if you listen to the podcast, you'll remember that when Japan was trying to take over Korea, delegates went to appeal to the rest of the world and international conferences and say, hey, our sovereignty is being threatened. What's going on here? And basically the entire white Western world decided that they did not have sovereignty, that Korea was not a sovereign state, and so they were just content to let Japan take them over. It's very, very shocking and sad situation that occurred, and a member of the delegation committed suicide on site in protest. So, just putting it up there. That was what was going on here. Worse still, during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, the USA, in cynical violation of the very first clause of the Treaty of 1882, known as the Good Offices Clause, entered into a secret arrangement with Japan, the Taft-Katsura Memorandum, to allow the latter to extend its sovereignty over Korea. The Good Offices Clause of the treaty stated, if other powers deal unjustly or oppressively with either a government, the other will exert good offices and bring about amicable arrangement, thus showing their friendly feeling. In fact, by the time the Russo-Japanese War broke out in February 1904, the USA had decided to abandon its relationship with Korea and to cultivate expansionist Japan and help it play its due role in Korea and Manchuria. Now, it was actually the end of the Russo-Japanese War prior to the Russian Revolution, obviously, Tsarist Russia, that led to the United States and Europe, etc., just deciding that Korea was somehow allowed to be taken by Japan. Korea had not been a colony of Russia. It had nothing to do with Russia. Russia and Japan fight a war. Russia loses. And then Europe and the United States are like, hey, Korea belongs to Japan now. It was very, very shocking and out of nowhere. And this is why the Korean people went and petitioned. They were like, what? How does that make sense? And everyone was like, no, you're not a sovereign country. Sorry, you belong to Japan now. And I talk about this in the podcast as well. But the reason for this is that to Europeans and Americans, Japan was considered a different type of Asian. It literally is like this weird racist thing that because Japan had started emulating some of the economic ambition and expansionist ambition of Germany, the United States and Europe was like, well, they're the most like us. They're the most white people of Asia, was literally how Americans and Europeans thought of them. It was very, very racist against Japanese people as well. So it was just like weird racism compounding on weird racism. The Chinese people and the Korean people were lumped together as being one type of Asian. The Japanese people were given this like Orientalist exceptionalism viewpoint by the United States and our allies in Europe. And basically this went into the decision where they were like, well, as many of the bad Asians as possible should be controlled by the good Asians, according to this racist landscape that they'd created. Exactly. It was a very, very fucked up situation for everybody involved in terms of how racism manifests. So that was part of why they were like, no, Just let Japan take you over. So Theodore Roosevelt made no secret of his contempt for Korea. He was proud to be known as pro-Japanese. He told Baron Sumatse Kancho that Japan should have a position in Korea just like we have with Cuba. A careful reading of the Taft-Katsura Memorandum, in which Theodore Roosevelt fully endorsed, would clearly show how the USA was seeking from Japan an assurance abjuring aggressive intentions in the Philippines, which it viewed as falling within its own exclusive sphere of influence, in return for its approval of Japan's extension of sovereignty over Korea. According to Kaneko Kintaro, who was a member of the Japanese delegation at Portsmouth Conference, Theodore Roosevelt told him, "Japan does not need money. You talk about collecting indemnity. Instead, take Sakhalin, Manchurian Railway, Port Arthur, and the coal mine at Lushun. Sooner or later, it will be better for Japan to take Korea. It will be good for the Koreans and Asia. I don't think Japan should take Korea right away, but sooner or later, it will be better for Japan to take her." About 2 months after the conclusion of the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1906, Theodore Roosevelt instructed the American minister in Korea that he should pack up and come home because the annexation of Korea by Japan will be good for Korea as well as Japan. A contemporary account by the well-known American missionary Homer B. Holbert sums up America's role in Korea at a crucial phase of Korean history, writing in 1906, quote, "But when the time of difficulty approached and America's disinterested friendship was to be called upon to prove the genuineness of its oft-repeated protestations, we deserted her, Korea, with such celerity, such cold-heartedness, and such a refinement of contempt that the blood of every decent American citizen in Korea boiled with indignation. How can we, the American people, prove to the Koreans that we were not accessory to this act, which was so contrary to the principle we have professed to hold?" Theodore Roosevelt might have felt immensely gratified when he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for his role in the conclusion of the Treaty of Portsmouth. But in our view, it was really a prize for the U.S. policy of appeasement of aggressive and expansionist Japan, and for its action in mortgaging away the sovereignty and independence of Korea to the Japanese. Thus, the USA, having first forced Korea open for the West, shut the door and turned to greener and safer pastures for feeding its imperialism. Before we examine the U.S. policy towards the Korean people's anti-colonial struggle, for brief reference to the historical experience of the Korean people during the colonial rule may be in order. Although the Japanese colonial rule was brief compared with the duration of the colonial rule of the Western imperialist powers, it was intense and barbaric. Not only did Japan exploit Korea to sustain its imperialist structure and war machine, but it also sought to obliterate Korea as a distinct cultural and national entity by pursuing a policy of Japanese-Korean unity. The Japanese colonial rule, especially after 1931, was characterized by a fusion of colonial and fascist orders and was hence fiercely anti-communist. The Korean people had thus to undergo the traumatic experience of living under one of the most organized and strident anti-communist terrors in colonial history. So much so that the struggle against anti-communism and the struggle against colonial rule got inextricably interlinked. The Korean anti-colonial movement passed through a number of phases, each marked by a different form of struggle. It also witnessed the guerrilla struggle of the communists. It assumed heroic proportions in time, with thousands laying down their lives and several thousands more imprisoned and undergoing torture. Indeed, it was an all-class nationwide movement, but for a microscopic minority of collaborators who were despised as much as the alien rulers. The communists and the leftists came to dominate the Korean nationalist movement after 1925, during the most brutal phase of colonial rule, so much so that, quote, leftism became almost synonymous with opposition to Japan. Communist resistance took on a nationalistic, patriotic aura. Now, chat, pause for a second to think about Juche. Think about the text we read from Kim Il-sung talking about nationalism and how to understand it in the context of communism and what this might mean for the history of the Korean Peninsula. The nationalists in Korea are one of the few places where nationalists and communists did not fight. And that is in part because Kim Il-sung was very successful at unifying their efforts, but also because how intensely brutal and barbaric the occupation of Korea was forced these people to align with each other to fight back against Japan and then later the United States. So this is really, when we talk about the unique material conditions of places, the unique material conditions of Korea in part were that the nationalists and the communists were united in a common struggle against occupation. And that is how we end up with a version of communism that embraces nationalism in Korea that might not make as much sense to do, for example, here in the United States. Which doesn't stop some people from trying, but hey, to each their own. So a perceptive author has the following observation to make on the standing and role of the Korean communists in the national movement. The communists succeeded in wresting control of Korean Revolution from the nationalists. They planted a deep core of communist influence among the Korean people, particularly the students, youth groups, laborers, and peasants. Their fortitude and, at times, obstinate determination to succeed had a profound influence on Korean intellectuals and writers. To the older Koreans who had groveled so long before seemingly endless foreign suppression, communism seemed a new hope, a magic torch. For Koreans in general, the sacrifices of the communists, if not the idea of communism, made a strong appeal, far stronger than any occasional bomb-throwing exercise of the nationalists. The haggard appearance of the communists suffering from torture, their stern and disciplined attitude towards the common enemy of all Koreans, had a far-reaching effect on the people. So think about this. Even if you weren't a communist, and you're seeing people around you fighting back against this oppression, right? A lot of the Korean nationalists were lost to South Korea's formation as a state, or is that an accurate reading of history? I would say, Aiden, that the nationalists ended up fusing with the communists in South Korea, or they were just seen as communists and they were stamped out the same way communists were. Anybody fighting against the U.S. military occupation was just labeled a communist anyway, and they had so much overlap by that point that, yeah, they were probably just labeled as communists and done away with as well, based on the data we have. Some nationalists were picked and favored by the U.S. military government. This is actually interesting. So basically the U.S. in the South was like, we need to create a fake liberal movement here. So the United States shows up. The peninsula is full of communists and a few nationalists, right? But all of them hate Japanese imperial control and are very resistant to the Americans showing up. So the United States is like, we need to create basically liberalism here. But they did not have the conditions for liberalism. In order to have the conditions for liberalism, you need, as much as we hate to call it this, as Marxists, right, a middle class. You need people who are enjoying the spoils of capitalism and benefiting from it and being like, maybe this isn't so bad. Korea did not have that, right? They had a handful of extremely wealthy people who had collaborated with Japan that were hated by everybody else on the peninsula, and a bunch of poor, battered, broken down resistance fighters. So when the United States showed up, they did go to a few nationalists that they found who were over the fight and kind of try to bribe them to come form a fake coalition party. So the United States knew they couldn't just take a handful of landlords that everybody in Korea hated and try to push them off as being a new political party representative of the will of the people, right? They had to manufacture democracy in South Korea in order to justify crushing the communists. So what they did is they took a handful of rich landlords. They imported Syngman Rhee, threw them into the mix with the rich landlords who had made money under imperial control and didn't much care. They were like, we collaborated with Japan, we'll collaborate with you in the United States, we don't care. And then they would go around to a few nationalists who were more centrist, and they would throw them in the mix and be like, and now look, it's a really diverse coalition of parties. Basically, they used a few nationalists as the Democratic Party, faux foil controlled opposition in this coalition of new government they were trying to fake create against the very, very rich corporate landlords. And this worked for a few people. Some nationalists, they tried to recruit them and they were like, fuck you, absolutely not. But some were like, I'm tired of fighting, sure. And so that did happen to a few of them, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, there's left-wing nationalism going on. And that's important to remember. Most of the nationalists were left-wing, extremely left-wing, yeah. Okay, so, sorry, my stomach's growling, you might hear it. So what's really interesting here, though, like, is that even if you were not a communist, you would see some nationalists throwing bombs. They would be thought of as the adventurous on the left during this time, right? And you'd be like, okay. And then you would see these communists emerging. They've been imprisoned for 10, 20 years for doing labor strikes, right? They have marks of torture all over their bodies. They had grown these long beards. Their hair was ragged. They had wounds that had healed. And they were stern and they were disciplined. And you looked at them and you thought, these people did that for me. These communists went to prison and endured torture for decades to defend me and my right to not be taken over by Japan, my right to not be taken over by the United States. So even if you weren't a communist in Korea, you were on the side of the communists. You viewed them as fighters for you. They defended you. They sacrificed so much. They put so much on the line to stand up for all of you. And that's really what this quote hammers home, is that even the people who were not communists in Korea were very, very, very sympathetic to the communists. The communists earned their respect, and that is going a long way there. The USA virtually wrote off Korea after Japan annexed it in 1910. It did not bother about either colonial rule or the anti-colonial nationalist stirrings. It did not express any sympathy or support for the Korean struggle for national independence. So far as it was concerned, the principles enunciated in the pledges made in the Atlantic Charter of August 1941, especially in respect to the right to self-determination of peoples, did not apply to Koreans. It was not until the first quarter of 1943 that the USA again started showing interest in Korea, albeit in the general context of Americans thinking regarding the post-war disposition of former colonial areas. Not that it felt any concern for the early independence of the Korean people or for the recognition of the inalienable national right of the Korean people to shape their destiny without interference. In 1943, Franklin D. Roosevelt, picking up the threads of U.S. policy towards Korea from where Theodore Roosevelt had left them in 1905 to 1906, displayed practically the same contemptuous attitude. Theodore Roosevelt had, as we've seen, argued in 1904 and 1905 that it was for the good of Koreans that they should be brought under the rule of an alien power like Japan. Franklin Roosevelt now argued on the same lines, ignoring the entire historical experience of the Korean people of being subjugated by colonial rule and their yearning for national independence. He was positive that the Koreans were unfit to govern themselves, right? And that's where the racism comes into it. And the anti-communism as well. And that they should be brought under a multilateral trusteeship dominated by his own country. At a meeting with then British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden on March 27, 1943, he mentioned Korea and Indochina as areas ripe for post-war trusteeships. However, Britain and France were not favorably impressed by Roosevelt's plan of multilateral trusteeship for the colonies, for it went against their own plans for the continuance of their rule in the respective colonies, right? So the United States is like, we should do a trusteeship for all these former colonies. And Britain and France were like, do you mean our colonies? They're not former, they're active. Those are our colonies. Those are our little colonies. Why would you take them from? What are you talking about? So this is what was going on here. They were like, what? Don't take those from us. Eden was quick to see how Roosevelt's ideas furthered American interest more than anything else. He later stated in his memoirs, Roosevelt hoped that the former colonial territories, once free of their masters, would become politically and economically dependent upon the United States, and had no fear that other powers might fill the role. The first time that the USA expressed concern for the enslavement of the Korean people, and agreed that Korea should become free and independent, even if in due course, was as late as November through December of 1943, at the Cairo Conference of the Three Great Powers, China, Britain, and the United States. Regarding Korea, Cairo Conference declared, the aforesaid three great powers, mindful of the enslavement of the people of Korea, are determined that in due course Korea shall become free and independent. What's important to note is that the USA, which had prepared the original draft of the Declaration, was ready only to express that it was mindful of the enslavement of the Korean people. It was not prepared to demand immediate independence for Korea. It did not believe that the Koreans were then fit to govern themselves. Significantly, Roosevelt substituted the words "at the proper moment" in place of "at the earliest moment," when the formulation on Korean independence in the original draft prepared by Harry Hopkins came up before him. So the original draft is like, earliest moment, and the United States is like, proper moment, right? When's the proper moment? Well, we'll later see the United States is like, after 40 or 50 years of us being in charge. That was what the United States thought the proper moment was. In other words, the USA merely wanted to de-link Korea from the Japanese Empire, but it did not want Korea to become independent, at least for a few more decades. The question in 1943 was not whether Korea should become independent, but how soon or when. And the U.S. answer was, at the proper moment, or in due course. And that ends up being the phrase that takes hold that we see a lot. History seemed to the Koreans to be repeating itself, first as a tragedy and then as a farce. For the Japanese premier, Harikei too, had, in announcing his country's cultural policy towards Korea following the historic March 1st, 1919 independence movement, used the phrase, in due course. He had said, it is the ultimate purpose of the Japanese government in due course to treat Korea in all respects on the same footing as Japan proper. The Koreans felt indignant and betrayed at the U.S. move to postpone their independence indefinitely on the spurious plea that they were incapable of governing themselves. How strongly the Koreans felt on the issue can be seen in one of the publications brought out by them outside of their country. They pointedly and sarcastically remarked, some Americans and Europeans who are not acquainted with the Koreans' historical background question, can they govern themselves? Koreans are an old nation. When the ancestors of Northern Europe were wandering in the forests, clad in skins and practicing rites, Koreans had government of their own and attained a high degree of civilization. The USA did not bother about the indignation of the Koreans. Franklin Roosevelt persisted with the idea of imposing trusteeship and of bringing Korea under U.S. tutelage after delinking it from the Japanese Empire. From Cairo, he went on to Tehran to meet Marshal Joseph Stalin in November of 1943. He tried to impress upon Stalin, among other things, the need to educate the peoples of Far Eastern Asia in the art of self-government to make sure that they would do capitalism, and to suggest the Philippine pattern for Korea. Right? They wanted to model. So this is important and interesting to note. When Japan colonized Korea, they were like, we just colonized Taiwan. We'll use the same model on Korea. It did not work. And this is not to say anything bad about the people of Taiwan who experienced colonization. But to be frank, the people of Korea were like, if you will not allow us to govern ourselves, we will become ungovernable. The way that Korean resistance manifested was in very direct conflict, confrontation, and fight back. Maybe the way that Taiwanese resistance manifested in the face of Japanese territorial expansion was to wait it out, survive, and hope for the best. I'm not here to judge how any colonized people respond to colonization, right? If you survive, you succeeded. And if you don't survive, it's not your doing, right? That is the other people who violently destroyed your country, your culture, your nation, whatever. However, it is worth noting that there is something unique about Korea's want to fight back. And so just like Japan thought that colonizing Korea would be easy, it would be just like colonizing Taiwan, they just sit back and take it, which, is not, they were trying to survive, right? They were trying to survive Japanese colonization, just definitely putting it out there, not judging how they responded to it. The United States thought similarly they would be able to colonize Korea the same way they colonized the Philippines, which was a horrific colonization as well in the Philippines, still dealing with the ramifications of that today, very obviously. But they did not expect to run into complications. They did not expect that the people of Korea would have a different history, and because of that, a different relationship with colonization and a different response than the people of the Philippines did. They were just like, yeah, it'll be easy, it'll be just like the Philippines, right? And it was not. The Korean people were not the people of Taiwan. They were not the people of the Philippines. All these people were different and thus had different ways of responding. But I do think it's very, very interesting that both Japan and the United States thought they could just stamp a model onto Korea, and in both cases that model failed, if that makes sense. So, going on to talk about this reference to the Philippines. He argued that Korea would, quote, need some period of apprenticeship before full independence might be attained, perhaps 40 years. Again, remember, Korea had been in charge of itself for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, but okay. Beginning with the first quarter of 1944, the U.S. State Department started envisaging American occupation of Korea prior to the creation of a trusteeship and linking the issue of American military action in and around Korea with American post-war aims in Korea. A paper prepared by the State Department pointed out the assumption by the United States of a major part in civil affairs and international supervision of an interim government would be greatly facilitated by the participation of the United States in such military operations as take place in and around Korea. So what is the State Department saying? We want to take over Korea after the war. We know that. So what should we do? Get a bunch of troops, U.S. troops, fighting the war in and around Korea. Get American troops as close to Korea or in Korea during World War II as possible, so it's easy for us to just kind of be like, now this is ours, right? So they were strategizing this during World War II even. It also mentioned the possibility of a military government in Korea, hopefully for a short period, but potentially for one of considerable duration, direct quotes. By the time the Yalta Conference took place in February 1945, the USA had made it clear that it was interested in carving out for itself a politico-military role in Korea after the Far Eastern War. This comes out clearly in various studies and papers prepared by the State Department on Korea. It may be argued that the opinions expressed in the papers prepared by the State Department were not necessarily expressed or articulated in the formal informal meetings during the wartime conference. However, on one crucial point, the American view had been crystallized by the time the Yalta Conference took place. The Americans had decided that Korea was of no concern to the Koreans. It was the concern of the others more than anyone else. It was the concern of the United States. The USA sought thus to internationalize the Korean problem. The Korean problem. Not a problem. Literally not a problem. Just the United States making it a problem because it wanted to be in control of Korea. In an important study on Korea prepared for the Yalta Conference, the State Department planners observed The problems of Korea are of such an international character that with the completion of military operations in Korea, one, there should be, so far as practicable, Allied representation in the army of occupation and military government in Korea. Two, such representation should be by those countries which have a real interest in the future of Korea, such as the United States, Great Britain, and China, and the Soviet Union, if it has entered the war in the Pacific. And three, the representation of other states should not be so large as to reduce the proportionate strength of the United States to a point where its effectiveness would be weakened. At his meeting with Stalin at Yalta on February 8, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt told him he had in mind for Korea a trusteeship composed of a Soviet, an American, and a Chinese representative. He added ominously that it had taken about 40 years for the Philippine people to be prepared for self-government, but that in the case of Korea, the period might just be 20 to 30 years. Following the death of Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, the Vice President Truman took over the presidency. He attended what turned out to be the last of the wartime conferences of the Allied powers at Potsdam in July of 1945. He later wrote that he did not discuss Korea with Stalin and Churchill. The records of the Potsdam Conference clearly show the USA had left it to the Soviet Union to conduct military operations in Korea and Manchuria against the Japanese forces. We shall discuss this point in greater detail in the next section. The trend of U.S. thinking on Korea at the time, however, is revealed in an extremely significant paper prepared for the conference by the State Department, and this paper stated, "It is possible that the Soviet Union will make strong demands that it have a leading part in the control of Korean affairs. If such demands require the establishment of an administrative authority in which powers other than the Soviet Union had only a nominal voice, it might be advisable to designate Korea as a trust area and to place it under the authority of the UN itself." Now remember, the UN helped the United States do this to Korea ultimately. Commenting on this paper, an author has aptly observed, the paragraph stated succinctly the essential problem, control of Korean affairs, and laid out three means to an end: an administrative authority, occupation, trusteeship, and the use of the fledgling UN organization. The sequence elaborated was indeed followed from 1945 to 1948. The paper overlooked only one matter: where is the voice of the Korean nation? Reagan in his proclamation also claimed, in 1945, American soldiers were crucial to the restoration of this ancient land's independence. It is not clear what Reagan was trying to convey. We've already noted how, up to the Potsdam Conference, or in the beginning of August 1945, the USA was utterly opposed to the independence of Korea. We've also noted how the USA contributed to and justified Japan's annexation of Korea and propagated the myth that the Koreans were incapable of governing themselves. If Reagan was contending that the USA displayed an important role in the defeat of Japan, no one can dispute it, although we believe that there was no military need to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where in consequence as many as 273,000 were killed, and no fewer than 195,000 received fatal doses of radiation. Also worth noting, because Koreans were enslaved by Japanese people during this time, many of them were enslaved working in Japan, and tens of thousands of Koreans died from the United States dropping nuclear weapons on Japan. By defeating Japan did not necessarily mean restoring Korea's independence. Restoration of independence meant, in the context of 1945, restoration of the rights of the Koreans to govern themselves, as in the years prior to Japan's imposition of the Protectorate on Korea in 1905. If until the end of the Second World War the USA was not interested in the restoration of Korea's independence, then what role did the American soldiers play in Korea in 1945 in terms of advancing the cause of Korea's independence? The American soldiers, in fact, did not play any role so far as the defeat of the Japanese soldiers stationed in Korea was concerned. They entered Korea only on September 8, 1945, a full 3 weeks after the defeat and unconditional surrender of Japan, ostensibly to accept formally the surrender of the Japanese forces stationed inside the area south of the 38th parallel. Also an interesting fact, when Japan surrendered from the war, the United States decided, they put down the 38th parallel and they'd let the Soviet Union be the protectorate of the North. Remember, they didn't do much. And the USA would be the protectorate of the South. Well, in the South, the USA and Japan, like I said, were doing good game, and hanging out with each other and partying. In the North, the USSR was doing what the USSR did best. It was killing fascists. It was slaughtering fascists. And the Japanese soldiers were so afraid of being held accountable for their crimes by the USSR that rather than surrender to the USSR, they would try to run for the 30th parallel so they could party with the Americans. So the Americans were partying with the fascists and hanging out, and the USSR was holding the fascists accountable. And that's just an interesting little piece of history. So the USA was quite keen that the Soviet forces should take on the Japanese in these two areas. And this was because, and this was in Korea and Manchuria, The Americans had a high opinion of the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria and thought that losses in an invasion of Korea would be greater than in a Kyushu invasion. They thought it better leave Manchuria and Korea to these losses to the Soviet land armies. So the United States was like, it's going to be harder to take over Manchuria because the Japanese fighters are really, really good there. So just like let the USSR deal with it. Ugh. The records of the Potsdam Conference show not only how the U.S. military planners attached tremendous importance to the need for the Soviets to enter the war against Japan, but also why the Soviets should take on Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea. An important document observed that with reference to cleanup of the Asiatic mainland, our objective should be to get the Russians to deal with the ethnic slur against Japanese people in Manchuria and Korea if necessary. So basically they were like, these people are really hard fighters. We don't want to die. Send the Russians in there to deal with it. Right. As for Korea, it was clarified that American amphibious landings had not been contemplated, and particularly not in the near future, and that there were no additional assault ships which would permit a landing in Korea, and possibly even an attack of Korea would have to be determined after the landings on Kyushu. The USA had planned an attack on Kyushu to commence around November 1st, 1945. Douglas MacArthur, the general, advanced an interesting reason why the Soviet forces should be asked to engage the Japanese forces in Manchuria at the earliest possible moment. Hold on, I have to cough. I'm going to do a water break. Oh my god, I'm almost out of water. Okay. I'm hydrating. I have to hydrate with coffee, sorry. Is this interesting to you guys? Are the academic ones a little too dry and long, or are they good? Are you locked in, or is it boring? Be honest, be honest. I want the stream to be good for you, too. Okay, yay, we're locked in. Okay, yay. This is okay for now. Okay, we can break it up. It is rigorous history, it's true. Okay. Yay! Alright. So, he said he was convinced the Soviets would want all of Manchuria, Korea, and possibly part of North China. This seizure of territory by the Soviets, they said, was inevitable. It did not work. This did not happen, actually. But the United States must insist that Russia pave her way by invading Manchuria at the earliest possible moment. Russia did not want any of this. And this is the thing. The West constantly mischaracterizes the goals and ambitions of modern-day Russia and formerly of the USSR. They're like, they want to expand. They want to take all the territory. No. Like, the USSR had no interest. They were just like, why would we want to do that? What? Like, we want to deal with our own shit at home. I don't know. Right? It's projection, exactly. Ghost in the Cell says, yeah, exactly. In short, seeing that its forces would suffer heavier losses engaging the Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea than in invading Kyushu, the USA thought it best to ask the Soviets to take them on instead. It felt that the impact of Russian entry on the hopeless Japanese may well be the decisive action levering them into capitulation. If the USA did not want to fight Japan in Manchuria and Korea, and if it did not want Korea to be independent in the sense of allowing Koreans to shape their national destiny without outside interference, why did its forces arrive in Korea in September of 1945? Right? We already know the answer. It's because they wanted a military presence there to justify taking over Korea. Wait, I missed something. Okay. You like but more commentary or contextual asides are welcome. Okay, great. Okay, that's good. Okay. Furthermore, did the arrival of the U.S. forces in Korea, or did the policies pursued by the U.S. forces in 1945 amount to restoration of Korea's independence? So, the significance of the 38th parallel. We all know the story, right? Two random dudes from the military were tasked with dividing Korea in half. Now, one of the things you need to keep in mind as we talk about this experience is the United States expected the USSR at the end of World War II to have more oomph involved in all of this. The USSR's main goal, though, remember, they just watched the United States drop fucking nuclear weapons on Japan. They just lost millions and millions and millions of their own people defeating the Nazis. They suffered fighting on their front. They had cities to rebuild. They had bombed out things they needed to fix. They're not interested in any of these shenanigans. They're especially not interested in going to war with the United States. The United States has not suffered very much loss in World War II. So the USA is like, and then we're going to have to fight the Russians. And the USSR is like, we are doing everything in our power to not go to war with the United States right now. And that you can see out actually in the Tito-Stalin split. Why did the Tito-Stalin split happen with Yugoslavia and the USSR? Well, because Stalin was like, hey, over there in Yugoslavia, you're getting really hyphy in a way that might just cause the USA to go to war with us, and we don't really have the capacity to handle that right now. Be a little bit more mindful, right? And this plays out in how the USSR responds to and interacts with the United States regarding the situation in Korea as well. So this is important to keep in mind. Motivation of the USSR, no war with the United States. Think about that today with China too. What's the motivation of China right now internationally? No war with the United States. And that's going to impact a lot of how they move. It is now a well-established fact that the USA was instrumental in suggesting the division of the peninsula at the 38th parallel, ostensibly for the purpose of accepting the surrender of the Japanese forces located there. The Japanese forces stationed north of the 38th parallel were to surrender to the Soviet forces, and those found south of the 38th parallel were to surrender to the American forces. So you're dividing it in half. The USSR, remember, the Japanese forces in the north of Korea are going to surrender to the USSR, and in the south they're going to surrender to the Americans. We talked about that a little bit with the partying versus the bang bang. The decision was taken during the night-long session of the State War Navy Coordinating Committee. And this was really the justification. They're like, well, we'll set the line. Not set the line for make two new countries. Set the line for where the Japanese forces are going to surrender. Oh, it sounds so innocent. Okay. So this happens around midnight, August 10th and 11th, 1945. Not during any wartime conferences. Harry S. Truman approves of the decision on August 13th and subsequently tells British and Soviet governments what's going on. It's like, hey, we did this, right? Hyphy. Hey, you know what? Yay area hyphy represent. I lived in San Francisco in the great and glorious year of our Lord, 2010. The Krayshawn era of San Francisco. Yay area hyphy. You will take hyphy from me, from my cold dead hands. 2 points need to be stressed regarding the rationale behind the American moves in suggesting the 38th parallel as the dividing line for the creation of two zones. Why did they choose the 38th parallel? It literally divided towns in half. Why did they choose this line? So, it's wrong to relate the division at the 38th parallel only to the acceptance of Japanese surrender. This is what the Americans were saying. This is not what their actual thought process was, though. So the article goes on and says, this is Christian again writing, if the purpose was only to the acceptance of surrender by Japanese forces, the USA could simply have asked the Soviet Union to carry out the task and complete the formalities throughout the peninsula. After all, the Soviet Red Army was there, right? The United States wasn't even there. So the Soviet Red Army had moved into the peninsula by the second week of August 1945 after successfully and swiftly engaging the much vaunted Kwantung Army in Manchuria. That's Christian kind of being like, oh, that army you were so worried about? Yeah, the Soviets crushed them. Piece of cake. Not an issue for the USSR. Just throwing that in, which I think is funny. The USA had wanted the Soviet Red Army to take on the Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea for fear of heavy casualties and for logistic reasons. But the Soviet Red Army had received the support of the contingents of the guerrilla forces belonging to the Korean People's Revolutionary Army and the Korean people. So the USSR shows up. What happens? Koreans are like, we're down to fight with you. They take up arms. Kim Il-sung's already up there. A bunch of Koreans are already in Manchuria fighting against the Japanese. Northern Korea and Manchuria had always had like a porous border between China and North Korea. And during the Japanese occupation of Korea, a lot of people from the north had actually fled into Manchuria across the border into China. And they had formed kind of like expat communities of North Koreans up there. So when the USSR soldiers roll up and they're like, what's up? We're here to fight your oppressors. Hey, in China, the Korean people are like, fucking bet. We've already been trying to fight them over here. Let's go. So they link up, and that's the reason why it was so easy to clean up the enemy forces in Manchuria at this time. Furthermore, it says the U.S. forces were nowhere near the peninsula to be able to move in rapidly. The closest U.S. forces at this time, by the way, were in Japan. They remember, they were like, we got to get over there near Korea so we can swoop in and take control in a way with plausible deniability. We got to be fighting World War II over there for preparation for when the war ends. But they weren't in Korea. They were in Japan. That was their version of being close. It therefore makes no sense to argue that Korea was divided at the 38th parallel for reasons of pure military expediency or in anticipation of a vacuum arising from the sudden collapse of the Japanese forces in Korea and Manchuria. In fact, Dean Rusk, who was one of the participants of the meeting on August 10th, had set forth the rationale behind the U.S. proposal for the 38th parallel. This is one of the guys who helped do it. It would appear that John McCloy, the representative of the Army who was there that day, asked him, along with Charles Bonesteel, hell of a name, to retire into an adjoining room and come up with a proposal which could harmonize the political desire to have the U.S. forces receive the surrender as far north as possible and obvious limitations on the ability of the U.S. forces to reach the area. So, Dean Rusk says that the 38th parallel was further north than could be realistically reached in the event of Soviet disagreement, and that when the Soviets agreed to the U.S. proposal, he was somewhat surprised. So he went further. He was like, oh, push it up there, and then the Soviets will be like, no, and we'll negotiate it down. The USSR was literally like, okay, man, whatever. We just killed a bunch of the bad guys. What do you want us to do? Okay, we're here, right? It would thus become clear that the USA wanted to harmonize the political desire to have its forces receive the surrender with the logistical difficulties it was encountering in moving its forces into Korea. We've already seen how, during the period from March 1943 to July 1945, the USA had argued that Koreans did not deserve independence because they were unfit to govern themselves. Yeah, it's almost as if it was not a land grab for the USSR, as Malrich says. Yes, it's almost as if there's no history of these countries wanting to do land grabs, as we were taught. Yes, Comrade Muffin says Kim Il-sung was fighting with the Chinese in the War of Resistance. So yes, and that's important to remember too. Many North Korean fighters had gone up that porous border, were in Manchuria, and were fighting alongside the Chinese against mutual and shared enemies. So that's really important to remember. That's why they were all up there and they were ready to fight. So when the USSR rolled up, they were like, bet, we're ready to go. And remember, Kim Il-sung at this time was already pretty notorious amongst the Japanese army for his fighting alongside the Chinese in this war. They reportedly made a whole division designed just to capture Kim Il-sung because he was such a revered fighter. And this was also the time when the infamous story happens where Kim Il-sung unites the nationalists and the communists together, when some of the nationalists end up being suspected of collaborating with the Japanese. And this kind of mass hysteria moment that happens, and he ends up destroying all of the records of the accused collaborators because he's like, this is a mass hysteria designed to divide us. Like, no. So this is all very relevant to this time. Very interesting part of Kim Il-sung's history. So we have a quote here that says, no sleight of hand can remove the decision on the 38th parallel from the continuum of American thinking on Korea since 1943. Although the decision was taken quickly and rashly in the hairy days of mid-August, it was the logical outcome of past planning. Furthermore, there was a purpose behind choosing the 38th parallel. Seoul, which was the traditional capital of Korea for countries, centuries? Countries? Again, sometimes these scans, the words are like not quite right. But whatever the case, Seoul was there. The headquarters of the giant bureaucratic structure created by the Japanese, 2/3 of Korea's population, a good share of its industry, a substantial part of the agricultural capacity, etc., lay south of the 30th parallel. Now think about this line. A good share of the industry, a substantial part of the agricultural capacity. Now, when we think about the tragic famine that affected the northern half of Korea in the 1990s, remember this. The South was chosen by the Americans. Why? Because it had a substantial part of the agricultural capacity for the entire peninsula. When we divided the North, we intentionally took the areas with agricultural capacity. We intentionally left the North without very much agricultural ability, without their ability to grow and produce their own food. And we did that intentionally, and we did that on purpose. Thus, the USA, which only a few days before was unwilling to engage the Japanese forces in Korea and Manchuria and was against the independence of Korea, conceived of the proposal to create two zones so that it might play a politico-ideological role in the developing situation in Korea in a decisive manner. Yep, like Palestine, exactly. It sought to ensure such a role for itself by its military presence and occupation. So basically this author's funny. They're like, oh, okay, you don't want to fight the war, you don't want to get your hands dirty, but you sure do show up afterwards to take what you feel is yours. Got it. You won't send soldiers to fight, but you'll send soldiers to steal and occupy. Okay, cool. Right? Where we go? So during the 3 weeks that preceded the arrival of U.S. forces, Korea witnessed several significant changes, even as they were passing through what was referred to as incandescent, intoxicating days. The trauma of colonial rule and the sacrifice and struggle for national independence constituted a powerful historical experience which profoundly influenced the Korean people's perception of the world after defeat and surrender of Japan. What the Koreans wanted to demonstrate to the world above all was they not only desired to govern themselves, but were capable of governing themselves without any outside interference. This explains why they showed tremendous enthusiasm about organizing their political life from the day of their deliverance. So literally, war comes to an end and the Korean people are like, it's on, let's go. Let's get it together. We can do this, we got it. They jump. they start setting up their own governments, like almost immediately. The People's Committees, as we talked about last week. They set up the Committee for the Promotion of Korean Independence, the CPKI, as an apex body under the leadership of the veteran patriot Liu Woon-hyung. Under the auspices of the CPKI, no fewer than 145 People's Committees were formed throughout the peninsula by the end of August 1945. We're talking weeks. They have a whole new government system set up in weeks. The People's Committees announced a whole range of socioeconomic programs because the Koreans hoped that the end of the Japanese rule would mark a new era in Korean history, a general social liberation, and that a revolution would follow. Thousands of political prisoners were released. They, along with other political figures who had organized and led the struggle against Japanese, actively involved themselves in the activities of the People's Committees. The People's Committees functioned as de facto politico-administrative organs pending formal and complete transfer of power and surrender of the Japanese forces. On September 6, 1945, the CPKI called a meeting of the National Assembly in Seoul, in which approximately 1,000 delegates representing a wide variety of groups and professions throughout the country participated. The assembly proclaimed the establishment of the Korean People's Republic. The Soviet forces, which had successfully engaged the Japanese forces in Korea, recognized the People's Committees in the area north of the 38th parallel and turned over the administrative authority to them on August 25th. So I want you to really think about this. The Korean people are like, we're setting up our own government. Look, we're in charge. Hey, all throughout the peninsula. The United States is like, haha, we're just drawing this line here across the half of your country. Don't worry too much about it. It doesn't mean anything. And they're like, okay. So they're getting to work. They're doing their government. The USSR shows up in the north, and they're like, yeah, we're supposed to collect the enemy. Oh, hey, you guys got a government. Cool. Hey, you guys handle all the administration while we go round up the bad guys. Awesome. Thanks. So the government that still exists in North Korea today is this government. There's never a change of government power. There's never a major shift. There's never a revolution. There's never a change. There's never a coup. There's a coup attempt at one point, but there's never anything. The government that they have today in North Korea is this government. North Korea is what would happen to all of the peninsula if the United States had not intervened and forcefully tried to crush and destroy it. So when you hear people say this weird shit about North Korea and their government, this is the government they are talking shit on. They are talking shit on the government the Korean people put together day one of their liberation from an imperial colonizing force. They are talking shit on an indigenous people's government that they chose for themselves, created themselves, and made themselves. They are talking shit on a sovereign people's movement to defend themselves in a post-colonial state. It is disgusting for people to say anything bad about this government whatsoever. This is the only government the Korean people have chosen for themselves since the year 1900. And it is the DPRK. That is it. That is it. This is why we defend this government, these people. This is their government, their choice. So, this is what happens. By August 25th, within a couple of days, the USSR is like, oh, cool, you made a government. Okay, you're in charge of everything. Bye. Let us know if you need anything. What happens in the South? Still to this day, they refuse to give over control to the Korean people to do this. The United States never recognized it, took it away, and still to this day refuses to let them have that government. So thus, in August to September of 1945, the Korean people established a broad national de facto administration which had effective control over the whole peninsula. And then the Americans arrive. It's the second colonization of the century. So horrible. Yes, also, Green Eggs and Hammer points out, the Workers' Party, the Communist Party of Korea that would later become the Workers' Party, it used to have a different name, was very good and beloved even before the founding of the DPRK. The party, different than the government, remember, the communists were the ones that everybody was looking at, beaten, haggard, tortured, emerging from prisons where they were fighting against the colonial occupation of Korea. That was the Workers' Party, right? That was what would become the Workers' Party in the North. Yeah, Workers' Party was a merger of two bigger parties, right? Exactly. What happens after this, right? What happens after this? It was in this political situation that the United States shows up. Great. The U.S. forces under the command of General John Reed Hodge as the commanding general of the U.S. Armed Forces in Korea, USAFIK, arrives in Incheon on September 8th, 1945. If the purpose of those forces was only to accept the surrender of the Japanese forces stationed in the area south of the 38th parallel, remember, which is what they were still claiming at the time, they would have left after a brief and formal surrender ceremony that was over on September 9th, of 1945. That it was not their main purpose became clear from the way they perceived the situation in Korea and their own self-assigned role much before their arrival. Proceeding from the strange view that the area south of the 30th parallel should be treated as an occupation zone or enemy zone and not as a liberated zone, they soon imposed their military government in Korea. It was a strange view because they refused to make any distinction between Japan, the imperialist fascist aggressor and colonizer, and the Korean people, who were the victims of the aggression and of colonization, and who had heroically struggled for the restoration of their national independence. A few days before the arrival of the U.S. forces, General Hodge instructed his officers that Korea was an enemy of the United States, and therefore subject to the provisions and the terms of surrender. American occupation sources later reported that government and its activities and attitudes were modeled upon the experience in enemy countries and on the usual instructions of training of an army in a hostile country. So the Americans show up knowing Korea is their enemy and they are there to conquer it. The Koreans don't know this, right? They don't know this is happening. Thus, instead of handing over authority and power to the CPKI after the surrender ceremonies and viewing Korea as a liberated zone, like was done in the North, General Hodge went to the incredible extent of announcing that the government general would continue to function with all of the Japanese and Korean personnel, including Governor General Abe Nobuyuki. So what happens? They show up, yay, we're free. And the United States is like, no, actually, you're gonna keep listening to the Imperial Japanese government. So you're not actually free. So World War II did not end, basically, for the people of South Korea in that moment. He haughtily and condescendingly told the couriers, by your conduct in the months ahead of you, you can demonstrate to the democratic nations of the world and to me as their representative your capacities and abilities as a people and your readiness to accept an honored place in the family of nations. He's like, prove to me you're worth it, Korea. Wild. On September 12, 1945, Major General Archibald V. Arnold replaced Abe as Governor General, and the title of the administration was changed from the Government General to the Military Government, or, to furnish its full form, the U.S. Army Military Government in Korea, USA MGIK. Yeah, Abe was a notorious war criminal. He was so disgusting. The American military government refused to recognize the Korean People's Republic and outlawed the CPKI and the People's Committees. Again, the People's Committees in the North became their current government. They made them illegal. On October 10th, 1945, it was announced that the USA MGIK was the only government in Korea south of the 38th parallel. General Hodge later told a UN commission that in September 1945, we came in and found communists actually ruling and controlling South Korea. So what do we learn from this? We learn, and this might be propaganda for sure, but it also is probably true. A lot of people in Korea were communists, or at least sympathetic to communists, and the communists were the ones who were highly organized in the resistance fight and highly organized to help found the People's Committees. When they talked about earlier how when the war ended, all the political prisoners were released, and very, very quickly functions were set up in the People's Committees. Those political prisoners that were released from prison were there for having left-wing politics. They were leftists, most of them communists. They were also the people who were instrumental in setting up the new government immediately. So it is not a stretch that he's correct when he says they showed up and found communists actually ruling and controlling South Korea. The Korean people were largely communists, at the very least sympathetic to communists, mostly. And they were establishing their own indigenous people's government, and it happened to be communist, right? Thus, the USA, in effect, invaded Korea in September of 1945 on the plea of accepting the surrender of the Japanese forces south of the 38th parallel. By militarily intervening and forcing a division of Korea, the USA tried to abort Korea's liberation process initiated by patriotic, democratic, pro-socialist forces whose mass base, impeccable record of struggle and sacrifice, passion for radical social and economic transformation, and zealous commitment for national independence were beyond doubt. This was reflected in the emergence appeal and programs of the CPKI, the People's Committees, the Korean People's Republic. The fact that needs to be stressed is precisely the fact that U.S. military occupation government knew well and sought to counter that the vast majority of the Korean people demonstrably desired not only immediate independence for united Korea, but also radical social and political policies. American soldiers no doubt played a crucial role in Korea in 1945. However, this role had nothing to do with the restoration of their ancient land's independence, as claimed by Reagan, but in robbing it of its independence and replacing one alien rule and language by another. The U.S. military occupation government continued until August 1948 in the area south of the 38th parallel. The U.S. military occupation of almost the same area, however, continues to this day, and still to this day, chat, because the overall command of all of the forces in South Korea rests with the U.S. military command in Seoul. In the final analysis, it is the U.S. military forces in South Korea that act as the guarantor and arbiter of the regime in Seoul. Indeed, in no other ex-colonial nation which has remained divided against the wishes of its people has the USA been more continuously, deeply, and brazenly involved than it has been in Korea. The involvement began when General Hodge and his forces landed in Incheon on the fateful afternoon of September 8, 1945. We have attempted to show Reagan's perception of U.S.-Korean relations since the Treaty of Chemulpo of 1882 and the American role in Korean history until 1945 is totally at variance with reality. It would, however, be naive to believe that Reagan and the world's most powerful imperialist forces, whom he represents, are ignorant of that history, or that there is no design behind the distortion. It is part of a calculated move to create a myth and spread falsehood about the nature of American involvement and interference in Korea. The brazen involvement of the USA in Korea and U.S. relations with its client regime in Seoul are sought to be idealized and glorified in several ways. They are represented as a model of enduring partnership sustained by the bonds of anti-communism. And the auspicious beginning of the enduring partnership is traced to the Treaty of 1882 by distorting the history of U.S.-Korean relations and the American role in Korean history. Okay, so you guys, a certain popular content creator whose entire account on TikTok is dedicated to spreading that same distortion, pro-American distortion of Korean events, once said that they don't know anything about South Korea. They only know about North Korea. And I say this all the time. That is a ridiculous thing to say. How do you only know about North Korea? If you only know about North Korea, you don't know anything about North Korea, right? Because the entire formation of a North and a South comes from a brutal colonial occupation by the USA on the heels of a brutal colonial occupation by Japan. Everything about modern day Korea must be understood through this lens. You will not, yes, the eyes and lips person, exactly. You will not understand why the United States funds sprawling disinformation propaganda networks of paid defectors telling you that people eat babies and rats eat babies unless you understand the United States' motivation in doing so. Often I tell people about the history of this and they go, okay, well, what does that have to do with Korea today? North Korea is horrible today, though, so what does that have to do with it? Two things can be true at once. And it's like, well, no. You only believe North Korea is horrible today because that is part of the ongoing sustained propaganda campaign and assault that the USA has launched on Korean independence and national sovereignty since the end of World War II. Right? And before that, arguably, when the United States had a hand in giving Korea away to Japan. If you do not understand that everything you think you know about North Korea is part of a convenient narrative designed to let people in the world know Korea cannot govern themselves, you do not understand anything, right? Why must we believe North Korea is a horrible place with an awful government? Well, one, because they're communist, very obviously. But two, because it goes into the now over a century-long narrative that Korea cannot govern itself. Right? If you believe that the government of Korea is doing horrible things to its people, you believe that the Koreans cannot govern themselves. And it is not a new idea. It is part of a narrative. You are walking in on the middle of a story that's been told for over 100 years about why Korea cannot be left to its own devices. Comrade Muffin says, reminds you of Palestine. Exactly. And for anybody not old enough to understand, this is exactly how Palestine was talked about for decades. Decades. We heard the same thing about Palestine, right? So, the final part of this section we're going to look at is a shorter, more poppy article, The Communist Warrior Stranded for Decades in an American Colony. Now, this is from the New York Times, New York Crimes. We got a pop slap article for us. And this is an interesting story that speaks to one man who has been kind of stuck on the wrong side of the border since then. So, I'm not sure if this is the right place in the document to go, so I might end up moving it after we read it. I plugged it in here, but maybe it's not the right place for it. But it's a very interesting story, so let's get into it. An Hak-sop was captured during the Korean War by the South and imprisoned for more than 40 years. Now, 95, he wants to return to the North to die. This is from last September. An Hak-sop leaned on a cane and a dining table as he lowered himself at glacial speed to sit on the floor of his home. The husk of a man who once left judo, he has been worn down by life in South Korea, an enemy nation that locked him up for more than 4 decades. His speech was slow and slurred because of his dentures, but Mr. An was eager to explain why he so hated the United States. From the words he used, comrades, struggle, imperialism, colony, independence, there was no mistaking the former North Korean soldiers' devotion to communism. "I am still trying to figure out this thing called capitalism," said Mr. An, 95. Along the walls around him were papier-mâché figures mocking Uncle Sam and the Statue of Liberty as money-loving, machine-gun-toting, bloodthirsty warmongers. People in South Korea don't realize that they are slaves in a colony and their leaders can't do anything without American approval. The Korean War ground to a ceasefire 72 years ago, after millions were killed, but it never ended for Mr. An, who as a young man fought on the North Korean side. He was captured by the South during the conflict and then survived 42 years and 4 months in prison on espionage charges, mostly in solitary confinement. Released in the mid-90s, he stayed on in the South to continue his campaign for his life's mission, the removal of U.S. military from the Korean Peninsula. So this is why I included this here, because to make it be like this is still going on today, but it might make more sense for us to move it when we talk about the Korean War. But, we'll see. These days, Mr. An is waging the last battle of his life. He wants to return to North Korea to die in his political and ideological home. Yes, this is all in the document, yes. The pursuit may be quixotic because the North has become so antagonistic to the South that it doesn't even want to communicate anymore. That's weird New York Times wording. The South has been trying to provoke the North into attacks to try to justify things like martial law at this time of 2025. But Mr. An has a small coterie of supporters who hold demonstrations on his behalf in Seoul, calling on both Koreas to agree to his repatriation as a gesture of reconciliation. For those who don't know, the South won't let people go back up to the North because they deem them national security risks. When his health allows, he joins them, marching slowly with assistance and delivering speeches from a wheelchair. "I don't want to be buried in the American colony that South Korea is," Mr. An said. "I want to spend what little is left of my life in the North, the only free and independent Korea there is, and want to be buried there beside my old comrades." On recent summer day, Mr. An sat for an interview in his squat concrete home near the demilitarized zone, which separates the two Koreas. Pumpkin vines crawled up the fence outside under a clear blue sky. Inside his living room was a riot of anti-American slogans and artwork made by his daughter, Jong Mi-suk, whom he adopted after he was released from prison. This is some good art. His doormat is the likeness of an American flag bearing the words, "Yankees move out." Miss Jong, a papier-mâché artist, has recreated a scene of U.S. troops massacring Korean women and children during the war. A favorite theme in North Korean propaganda, they say. This again, New York Times. Framed on the wall are quotes from Jimmy Carter, who once called the United States the most warlike nation in the history of the world, and Martin Luther King, who said the U.S. government was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Mr. An is hard of hearing now and often loses his train of thought, but he betrayed no regrets as he told the story of his service, his long imprisonment, and his current life in what he considers a rich but oppressed nation. "South Korean people may claim they live well, but how do you define living well?" he said, as he spoke about his preference of the North Korean political system and his own eventful life. Mr. An was born in Ganghwa, an island west of Seoul, in 1930, when Imperial Japan ruled Korea. So remember, he was born in the South. He was a teenager when the Japanese occupation ended, thanks to the Allied victory in World War II. The Korean peninsula was divided into a communist North and a pro-West South. Again, it was divided into a free North and an occupied colony in the South. But to many nationalists, like Mr. An, colonial rule never ended. It just changed hands from the Japanese to the Americans. Korea soon plunged into an internecine war. While Chinese troops streamed across the border to help North Korea, the U.S. military maintained its air superiority with a horrific bombing campaign. Mr. An was about 20 at the time. And this is about the Korean War. "I saw people hit by an American napalm bombs," he said. "When they pulled off their burning clothes, their skin came off too. What I remember to this day is young women covering their private parts with their burning hands, even when they were dying." I'm going to cry, sorry. I'm a crier. For anybody new here, I cry all the time. In October of 1952, Mr. An led a squad to the south to connect with communist partisans on South Korea's rugged eastern mountain ranges and help them rebuild guerrilla operations. Fully armed in North Korean army uniforms, the group fought running battles as it was repeatedly ambushed on the way to its destination. By April of 1953, 3 months before the armistice was signed, Mr. An was the only one still alive. Starved, he was cooking 2 potatoes on a hill when South Korean rangers swarmed him. A military court sentenced him to life in prison on espionage charges. Leftist prisoners like him were held in solitary cells, barely larger than a bed, with a hole in one corner that served as a toilet. Maggots crawled out when the inmates were given food. The inmates were tortured until they signed with their thumbprints a statement saying they had renounced their communist ideology. What's worth noting here is that if you come from the North into the South, they hold you in conditions a little better than that, but they hold you basically in a re-education camp at the border, and they make you renounce your North Korean citizenship and ideology as well. Still to this day. At night, Mr. On's ward rang with the howls of fellow communist prisoners being persecuted. Mr. On lost all of his teeth in prison. He was flogged with knotted ropes and waterboarded with water laced with pepper powder until he choked and fainted. In winter, his tormentors tied him naked to a chair in a room where the floor was covered in ice. They dripped freezing water on the same spot on top of his head. After a while, each drop felt like a huge rock, Mr. On said, both hands folded over his cane. He paused with his eyes half closed, as if he were reliving those memories, the momentary silence taken over by the buzzing of cicadas outside. Passing out was the only way out, he said. When I came to, I would check my thumbs for ink. When there was none, I knew I had survived another day. Prisoners who affixed their thumbprints were further humiliated when they were forced to read the oath they had signed in front of their unconverted comrades. I endured the torture not because my political or ideological beliefs were particularly strong, but because I hung on to my dignity, Mr. On said. After the war ended, the South was ruled by dictators who for decades enforced the conversion program. It started petering out after the South began embracing democracy in the 1980s, though the public heard little about them. Mr. On was paroled in 1995, along with another man, Kim Sun-myung, who had also served more than 4 decades in detention. And again, I want you to remember, he was from South Korea. This is not a man from the North. He is from South Korea, right? But before, there was a North and a South Korea. He is from Korea, but the southern half. In 2004, a government panel reported 77 inmate deaths connected to the conversion through torture program. Later, another panel recognized Mr. On as a victim of torture. By the time Mr. On was released at age 65, South Korea had been transformed into a vibrant democracy and economic powerhouse. Okay. Kaltimus says, the so-called communist terror and torture we hear about, oops, all capitalist and fascist behavior. Yep, it's all projection. To his dismay, tens of thousands of U.S. troops were still stationed in the South. The North was in the throes of a catastrophic famine. And remember that famine that we talked about earlier. Remember? We divided it up. We left them without productive farmland. And then, of course, in the years in between, we launched a massive blockade against them that made it hard for them to get the equipment they needed to be able to do farming. And then when a natural disaster struck, the small amount of farmland they had, 2 actually back to back, they starved to death. That's the United States doing as well. Mr. On got married 5 years later to a woman who insisted on tying the knot despite differences in their political background and age. She was 30 years his junior. In 2000, the South repatriated 63 unconverted former inmates to the North, where they were welcomed as heroes. Mr. On chose not to join them. There was much debate with my comrades about what we should do, he said. I decided to fight on in the South, shouting for the withdrawal of American troops, even if there was only one soul who would listen to me. He found work in an herbal medicine shop, and his wife, Lee Chai-won, gave piano lessons. Mr. On's misgiving about the capitalist South intensified when he saw jobless men bumming cigarettes and standing in line for work during the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, and when he and his wife were swindled out of their life savings a decade ago. Homeless, Mr. On and Miss Lee were invited to live with Lee Juk, a pastor who has helped with their expenses and housing in a village so close to the border with North Korea that approval from the South's military is required to visit. He was persecuted in the South. If the North abandons him too, he will have nowhere to go, said the Reverend. During the interview, Mr. On dug out an old photo of fellow unconverted prisoners who also spent decades in prison. He did not see most of them again after they returned to the North in the year 2000. This is the photo. Later that day, Mr. Lee drove Mr. On to a tall military barbed wire fence. That's the Reverend Lee. The farthest north that civilians are allowed to travel. Mr. On gazed at North Korea across the river border and at migrant birds flying north. Mr. On's public activities have consisted largely of attending small weekly rallies near the U.S. Embassy in Seoul and shouting for the withdrawal of American troops. When he showed up for similar rallies near government buildings this summer, supporters hugged him, rubbed his arthritic hands, and gave him cool water and an umbrella for respite from the heat. Last month, they organized a symbolic march to the border to press their demand for his repatriation. Mr. On joined them with a North Korean flag, but the police stopped them before they could reach the off-limit zone. Mr. An blames the Korean divide squarely on the Americans. The U.S. troops will never leave until you force them out, he said. A feudal lord will set slaves free only when they rise up to make him fear for his life. And here's one of the protests. His slogan sounds hopelessly out of place in today's South Korea, where most citizens want the U.S. troops to stay on their soil to help guard against North Korea and China. This is a relatively new development. They would not have been able to publish this until 2025, and maybe just to drive that point home, we'll trying to find this by year. Okay, so here's a map or a chart just for reference up until 2024. And the top blue is it should be done when circumstances get better. This one here underneath is current state is good. See that slowly goes on the rise over time. The red is it should be done as soon as possible. They just started asking that in 2019. They didn't ask before. The green is I am not interested in unification. And the gray is it should be done as soon as possible no matter what the consequences are. So this is just since 2007, but if you looked at this even before 2007, the numbers were way, way different. So basically what we see is over time, people become less and less interested in unification. Why? Because the older people die out. Younger people are less interested in unification. They like the status quo. Most people like a status quo, you know. So it's a bit of a stretch for them to say, let's see, how do they word it? No, where is it? Where most citizens want the U.S. troops to stay on their soil to help guard against North Korea and China. You know, that's when we look at this, what we see is most people in Korea still want, overwhelmingly, the most popular answer is that reunification should happen when the circumstances get better. We don't know what that means, but they still do want reunification. So that's a bit of a specific way they chose to present that data, right? And so I just want to make that clear. And that is something that's also been down as a byproduct of time. If you ask that same question in 1980 or 1990, you'd get much different results as well. So Korean reunification, the ideal Mr. An has cheered for so long, looks more distant than ever, even as North Korea says it no longer considers South Korea a partner for reconciliation. And again, this is a relatively new development because South Korea literally tried to provoke them into war and flew drones over their head to justify cracking down with martial law against people. So that's when this change came about. This was a direct response to actions of South Korea. In July, Mr. An was hospitalized with shortness of breath. South Korean officials visited him to confirm his desire to return to the North. They say they have no channel of dialogue with the North to discuss his fate and are waiting for Pyongyang to react to news about his final wish. Fearing death, Mr. An recorded a message on video. And look how they turn this. Look how they make it look like North Korea won't let him go home. But the reality is that South Korea will not let you go back. So, in the dying moment with no time left, they're like, okay, fine, we'll let you go back. Ask the North, knowing that this process takes time and this man has been asking for this for years. Fearing death, Mr. An recorded a message on video. I'm sorry I could not finish the work I came here for, he said from the hospital van. In a video taken by Mr. Lee, Mr. An sought forgiveness if he hurt people with some compromising views. Please understand that I am a man from North Korea, he said. Ugh. So, there are people in Korea today still fighting this fight. Remember, though, they're imprisoned. They're treated horribly for it, and this is why we don't hear from a lot of these people, right? It's very, very heartbreaking and sad. Now, I just want to say, again, about the enemy, right? The situation with North Korea and reunification. North Korea, if this was just in 2024, a formally abandoned peaceful reunification is a key policy goal. In announcing the drastic shift, the North's leader, Kim Jong-un, said the North no longer saw the South as the partner of reconciliation and reunification, but instead as an enemy that must be subjugated if necessary through nuclear war. Right? So in recent decades, the reunification of the two Koreas has become increasingly unlikely as the economic gap between them widened and mutual enmity deepened. I mean, this is, again, a very biased way of talking about this. But, the South is an American neocolony. It is a highly militarized U.S. presence there. And they were trying to provoke the North into attacks. And that ultimately led to the president of South Korea who tried to do that being overthrown, taken out of office, and a new president being put in place. The Irish impulse to call it Northern Korea. Yeah, Northern Korea. I do that as well. So that's probably going to be as much as we can get through today. Next week, we will pick up with the USA brutally repressing the people in South Korea, including backing the genocide of Jeju Island. And we will talk about what the United States does in the South to stamp out the communist presence there. And yeah, I feel like maybe the story does still fit in here well. There's some larger texts coming up in here that we're obviously not going to be able to read through all of them. So, we'll take some excerpts here and there as we can. We're starting to get into big, long text category coming up. Does anybody have any questions about anything or any thoughts or observations about this? Is there anything we should think about? What can we do to spread this? Great question, Obsis. Be unrelenting and vocal in your support for North Korea as you are with Palestine. There is a reason why, again, I always show this tweet, but, it's... Hold on. See if I can find this on Twitter. If not, I have a photo of it on my phone I can send really fast. Yeah, he was still in there, okay, yeah. What would you say is the position of Americans about Korea today? We're literally taught that North Korea is evil, big, scary, mean, everything is bad, that the people are suffering under a brutal regime, that the good leftist thing to do is to oppose North Korea, that South Korea is the free Korea. I mean, we're taught everything horrible in the world that you can think about. And it's worth noting, South Koreans are the only people more propagandized about the North than us. Because they have not only the National Security Act, which makes it illegal to say anything positive, but they have their own propaganda networks. Because remember, the goal is to ensure that they never want reunification. That's our goal. So this is a tweet I usually show people to give you confidence in defending this like you defend Palestine. The DPRK was once in Gaza's position. 90% of its infrastructure was destroyed, over a quarter of their population decimated, on decades of starvation that took millions of more lives via sanctions. Inshallah, I get to see it, and regions like mine reach their success in rebuilding and development. So not only is North Korea very similar to what Palestine experienced, Palestinians look to North Korea as a beacon of hope. Colonized people look to North Korea as a beacon of hope for what you can build if you have peace and security and stability one day, right? It's very, very challenging to get people to believe this, to talk about it. But I think, the more we can talk about it, the better. The more people hear that, oh shit, it's a lot of people saying this. It's not just me. For a long time, it was very, very rare to find people talking about Palestine, right? White people, anyway, in the West, in the United States. So, that's a thing too. The things that I usually use to break through to people is like, the Black Panther Party liked the DPRK, right? Palestine liked the DPRK. DPRK's always supported Palestine, always supported the Black Panther Party, always supported Black liberation movements. To get really people to, there is a link to the document. I'm not sure what the update is on him. We could take a look, maybe. That's a good question for us to look at. Something I think is really funny is that whenever I tell people to look at this resource document, this is the public resource document I share with people, they are always like, let me see if we have any updates on him. This is the real story of this man, too, where they say North Korea is where this 95-year-old wants to die. South Korea won't let him go. The New York Times kind of positioned it like the North wouldn't let him in. No, it was the South that would not let him go home, because the South has a rule that North Koreans are not allowed to go back to the North. That is why, we end up with stories like this. We end up with stories like this: a North Korean defector who struggled in South Korea stole a bus and tried to drive across the border because they won't let you go back. They confiscate your passport. They call you a national security risk, right? I feel like we should have confidence. I also couldn't find any updates on his story. So sorry. So I think we should just have confidence in talking about this, right? And, people eventually just change their minds when they get shamed publicly. That's it. They get publicly shamed. They don't even... Look at the number of people running around with Ukraine flags in their bios, Palestine flags in their bios. They don't even know what they believe, So, I don't know. I do think if you're in one of the areas and you're able to go out on the 15th for one of the protests, one of the marches, that would be really, really good to end the U.S. military occupation of South, right? That would be helpful. People have to escape the South Korea to go to the North. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yep. That's true. No, every accusation is a confession. And just so you guys know, people are shamed for being anti-Iran now. Yep, exactly. There's a protest August 15th in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, and New York City. And it is a U.S. out of Korea protest. So if you check out Nodutdol, Nodutdol, on Instagram, they'll have the flyers up. It's at 1 p.m. on the West Coast and 4 p.m. on the East Coast. And they're calling for a day of action for everybody to come out. Yeah, this is true. Call Team Moose. You offer the average American new info and they take it as a documentary identity. We have 10 minutes left. Maybe just for the opposite of a palate cleanser. So right now what's happening, chat, is we're in reality. Us together, we're in reality. We understand the current nature of the occupation of Korea. We understand that the North is the free Korea, that that's an indigenous peoples movement. We understand how their government was set up. We understand what's going on. We're in a shared reality right now, right? It's not the reality the rest of the world lives in. And I remember getting so frustrated when I met my current partner. I was like, I just don't know how to get through to people on this, And not just about Korea, but, and imperialism in general, and how frustrating that experience can be. But, and one of the reasons I liked them really early on, the pictures of them as a little kid with the base babushka granny wearing the hammer and sickle hat really was nice. But more than that, too, they were like, I once lost friends because I defended North Korea. I stood up for North Korea, and I lost friends over that. And I was talking to them about this, and I was like, it's so frustrating, It feels like it should be so obvious. It feels like standing up for Korea should be the most obvious thing in the world to people. And my partner was like, you have to understand, they are living in a different world than you are. Their reality is not the same as yours. They know that is an evil, evil place where bad things happen. They know that only a bad person would defend that, or a crazy person. That's what they know to be true. And that's, very, very hard, but it did help me contextualize it. It was my partner was correct when they said that. So as a reminder of the false reality that most people are living in, this is the world that they're living in, right? This is Radio Free Asia. This was created by the CIA in the 1950s. And this was designed to spread negative propaganda about North Korea so that we could convince people to be really opposed to reunification forever. Oh, you'd also like info on the Minneapolis event? I'm not sure. Maybe go comment on their Instagram or DM them and ask them. I bet they'll tell you. Korea document shows how hard it is to have receipts on Korea. Americans won't watch Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang because it's 35 minutes long. Exactly. You won't read anything. Oh, when they look at my document, they say, oh, it's all fake. None of it's real. It's blog posts and Reddit. I'm like, what are you fucking talking about? Literally, it's academic text from JSTOR. Text you guys should like. You love the New York Times. You hate the New York Times now? Okay. It's pretty wild. But yeah. So, this is what we learn about, right? This is Chinese police arrest Uyghur sisters and mother in Urumqi for sending goods to Turkey. And it's not just about North Korea. It's about China as well. Oh, and Tibet. Escape from Tibet. This is what the most Americans believe. Let's see if we can find something about, North Korea. There it is. They're making a bridge. This is fine. Okay, here we go. They're starving to death, of course. North Korean operatives use fake identities. We'll look at all these. All right, so this is the kind of stuff we're learning about, obviously. And this is the CIA. The CIA created this and is now part of the USAGM. That's the U.S. Agency for Global Media. This is congressionally funded U.S. state media. This is U.S. state media that we are looking at right now. So, North Korean buildings near DMZ could be rocket infrastructure, experts say. 21 newly built drive-through buildings likely designed to shelter launch vehicles. So fear-mongering, right? Fear-mongering. They want to blow us up. They've made a video. Let's look at this video.
Satellite imagery analyzed by Radio Free Asia confirmed North Korea has quietly constructed at least 21 identical buildings just north of the demilitarized zone.
U.S. government
What
state
are these
media we're
buildings
watching
for?
right now. U.S. government
These
state
structures
media.
have been built between 2023 and 2025.
Look
at
how
small
intentional
North
it is,
Korean
though.
Army bases.
You would
A
feel
few
like this was
kilometers
organic
from the
Korean
border
reporting.
and about 50
They do
kilometers
that on
from
purpose.
Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Each structure is about 52 meters long and features a drive-through design that lets military vehicles enter from one end and
Right? Okay, so we know that. Right? This is what they got going on. So any zany story you've heard about North Korea, it probably came from here. It probably came from Radio Free Asia. Heat maps show largest greenhouse farm in North Korea at less than half capacity. Oh my God, they're starving to death again. Again, no speaking of the fact that they have to have all of these greenhouses and food is a constant struggle for them. Why? Because the United States didn't leave them with productive farmland. Right? According to state media, the country's leader Kim Jong-un personally guided the construction. Oh, so Kim Jong-un's an idiot who doesn't know how to build it. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have said idiot. But Kim Jong-un is an ignoramus, a fool, a silly little man who doesn't know how to build a greenhouse, right? That's the implication here. Yeah, NK News, 38 North, Daily NK, Radio Free Asia, all funded with our tax dollars. This is what our tax dollars spend money on. So this guy can have a job telling you that North Korea is going to blow you up. Right? The test a North Korean hacker could not pass. Remember, one of the markers, cultural markers of incoming fascism, our enemy is both strong and weak. That's all Radio Free Asia is. Our enemy is both strong and weak. North Korea is both strong and weak. China is both strong and weak, right? That's exactly what this is. Why do the border cities look so good? Well, they've got solar panels, but just on those cities, just for show, probably, right? North Korea is trying to resolve its chronic energy problems. I wonder why. It's almost like you put them under a global blockade that affects their ability to import fuel. Right? So they've given you this, oh, wow, they have lights now. Oh, okay. Right? Downtown China, that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to be there, chat. I'm going to be there. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. But yeah, this is the news that we consume, right? I want to find some of the most, there's like some ridiculous stories that end up in here. Oh yeah, this is where the story of the successor spotlight comes in. Oh, this is fake. How North Korea uses AI and deepfakes as a weapon. Their targets: officials, journalists, human rights activists, and researchers, right? Chronic problems. Weird way to spell sanctions. Exactly. North Korean hackers. We have to watch this. Chat, we have to watch this.
Under the wise leadership of the great leader Comrade Kim Jong-un, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has decided to completely renounce all nuclear weapons, open the gates of the Republic to the entire world, and introduce a Western-style democratic system.
But this is fake.
Yeah, obviously. What? Like, what am I
This
looking
clip
at?
was created with deepfake technology. Using
This is
tools
not made by the
emulating
DPRK.
that.
No.
And North Korea hackers are already using the same tech.
Wait. So they've made a bad AI video, and then they're like, "This isn't real." Yeah, no shit. We can all tell you used a horrible version of AI. Also, I think this is from September 2025. Okay, so maybe it was worse back then. And then they're like, North Korea could be doing this as well. They could be. They could also be doing. We did this one, but they also could be. This is like the meme that's like, oh, this would be life under communism, but then it's just a picture of life currently under capitalism. That's literally what's going on. This is a version of that. Okay, sorry. I knew it would be bad because it's Radio Free Asia, but I was not prepared for how bad it would be. Sorry.
Technology as a weapon. Recently, South Korea cybersecurity firm Genius revealed that North Korea hacking group using
AI-generated deepfake military IDs to impersonate defense agencies and launch phishing
Thanks, Sweet
attacks.
Court. I will. I'll probably get
This isn't
another
new.
phone to bring.
North
Maybe.
Korea IT workers have long used AI and deepfake to build fake identities.
They appear in video interviews with AI-made faces and voices.
Cybersecurity expert David
This is the
Wojcicki,
weirdest video I've ever
co-founder of
seen.
Vivek, shared a video on LinkedIn that expert believes show these workers in action.
Can you take your hand and put it like in front of your face?
This very obviously looks fake to me.
No, like put it like this.
At first glance, it looks weird. But if
Yeah,
you
the
watch
budget cuts him
closely,
hard, yeah.
something feels off. If this worker get hired, they don't just collect a paycheck. They can plant malware, steal company data, and funnel money back to North Korea's weapon program.
Like, what? This is all speculation, by the way. They're like, what if North Koreans got a job and then they gave the money to
And
build
make
bombs to
life
North
easier for
Korea? You're like,
everyone.
what?
But in North
And
Korea's
their weapon
hands,
program specifically.
it becomes a weapon. One that threatens your personal data, private company, and even national security.
Yeah, so just to clarify, their point was, we made a deep fake of AI. North Korea could be doing this too. They could be using deep fake AI videos to get jobs and then use the money from their job to give to build bombs. They could do that. That's something they could do. Just putting it out there. Literally, that's the whole fucking video. It's why, yeah, what if it did? This is Ancient Aliens level. Could it be that North Korea is using deep fake AIs to get jobs and then send the money back to the government to build missiles? Could it be? I guess it fucking could. I guess the world can be made of pudding. Anything could be. I don't know. It's just so, yeah, it's just U.S. taxes. It's literally what's happening with our taxes. We get jobs and then send money to the government to build bombs. Oh my God. They do have jobs. Yeah, people in North Korea do have jobs outside of the country sometimes. But it's, I don't know, it's very, very, I could be a landlord, yeah. Oh my God. Did you ever see Anchorman 2, the sequel? I had this roommate who was like weirdly obsessed with Anchorman when I lived in Santa Cruz. He would just watch it on repeat all day long. So I have like all of Anchorman 1 memorized. And then when Anchorman 2 came out, I'm pretty sure he put it on and that's how he sounded. But whatever. I watched the Anchorman 2 once. And there's this part where it's like a couple and they're both news anchors, right? It's Ron Burgundy and his wife, I guess, in the sequel. And the wife wants to be a serious journalist and she secures this like important interview with a world leader. I can't remember. And at the same time, he is trying to compete with her viewership numbers, and they don't have anything. So he's trying to like fuck over her views, basically. So all they have is a car chase. So they play the car chase, and his producer's in his ear. He's like, I don't know what to say. I don't have anything else to say about it. They try to present it like it's breaking news. And the producer's like, speculate wildly. So he just starts like, yeah, oh, this could be happening. I don't know, like speculating wildly. And his numbers end up surpassing hers. Like that's the news people like. But I think about that one quote, speculate wildly, so much when I consume news. Speculate wildly. And I hate that Anchorman 2 has given me this insight to how news programming works in the 21st century. But I do think it is quite funny because it is, yeah, speculate wildly. That's that whole fucking video. Yep. Yeah, the video. Yes, the interview was with Yasser Arafat. Oh my God. Is that real? Jesus. It's too real. It's actually real. Okay, chat. Well, that concludes our live stream for today. A lovely Topics Tuesday, full of horrors of the world. Anti-imperialism is a hard fight. It's hard to be on the right side of history sometimes. People want to try to ruin your life over it. But you do it. You don't do it because it's popular. You do it because it's right. And that's what we do, right? We stand with the people of North Korea as they fight against American imperialism, and we stand against the people of South Korea as they fight against American occupation. So we will be doing more of that next Tuesday for Topics Tuesday. We will be back. And tomorrow we will just do our regularly scheduled programming, which is going to be current events. So thank you so much, everybody. Today we're going to send you to Larry. I know, my stream makes me cry too. Man, it's It's messed up. It's messed up. And then you get these ding-dongs on the internet. Just saying the most vile shit you can imagine. Okay. All right, let's send you to Larry. Maybe Larry will have some more uplifting Korea content. Because it is uplifting that the North manages to resist. It is. Okay, I'm sending you to Larry now, chat, and I will see you tomorrow. I am Professor Ding Dong. I am the professor of all the Ding Dongs. I will lead them. I will lead them kicking and screaming to the correct opinion on these issues, damn it, or die trying. That doesn't mean I'm suicidal. Okay, thank you, bye.